8 Harleys, one forgotten gas station, and a 7-year-old girl walking straight toward the most dangerous-looking men in the Arizona desert. Nobody moves. Nobody breathes. The Iron Vultures MC has buried 3 brothers this year. Their road captain, Gage Mercer, hasn't slept more than 4 hours in 6 days. He's got gravel in his boots, a dead phone in his pocket, and a daughter who stopped answering his calls 3 months ago, the kind of man people cross the street to avoid. So when the little girl in the yellow dress holds out a box of homemade cookies and looks him dead in the eyes, something cracks open that no battlefield ever could. This is that story. Stay with me until the end. If this hits you somewhere real, hit that like button and drop a comment. Tell me what city you're watching from tonight. Let's go. The desert didn't care about anyone's feelings. That was the first thing Gage Mercer had learned about Arizona. Not from a book, not from someone who'd driven through on a family vacation with the air conditioning running and fast food bags in the back seat. He'd learned it the hard the way he'd learned most things, crouched in a ditch somewhere between exhaustion and fury, watching the sun do whatever the sun wanted to do with absolutely no regard for the men sweating beneath it. Route 89 stretched out ahead of the formation like a dare. 8 motorcycles running tight, engines singing that low, deep percussion that pressed against the chest like a hand laid flat over a wound, the kind of sound that didn't ask permission, that didn't apologize. Gage rode point because he always rode point, not because anyone told him to, but because the road captain position wasn't ceremonial in the Iron Vultures. It was structural. Someone had to set the pace. Someone had to decide when to push and when to pull back. Gage had been doing that for 11 years, and somewhere in those 11 years he'd forgotten that the skill applied to more than asphalt. The memorial patch on his left arm was new, still stiff. 3 patches in 18 months, and each one cost them something they couldn't get back. Dobie Raines, 44, cardiac arrest in his sleep. Marcus Webb, 38, a semi-driver who'd been awake for 30 hours and crossed the center line on a Tuesday morning. And last week, Trey Caldwell, 31 years old, the youngest full member the chapter had ever voted in, who'd simply decided one night in his garage that he'd run out of road. The memorial ride was supposed to be about Trey. It was supposed to be about all 3 of them. But somewhere south of Flagstaff, Gage had stopped thinking about Trey and started thinking about the voicemail he'd left his daughter 2 weeks ago that still hadn't been returned, and the guilt of that, of letting his grief bend toward himself, sat in his stomach like a swallowed stone. He heard Cole Barrett's engine drop half a beat behind him. Checked the mirror. Cole was riding slightly wide, the way he did when the road got too quiet and his head got too loud. 14 years in the Marines, 2 deployments to places that didn't exist on official maps, and Cole still couldn't drive through the desert without his shoulders pulling up toward his ears. Gage had seen it 100 times. He never said anything. Cole never asked him to. The gas station appeared like a mirage, except that mirages were prettier. This was a Horizon fuel stop, and whatever optimism the name had been built on had long since surrendered to the elements. The awning over the pumps was sun-bleached to the color of old bone. One of the overhead lights was out. A handwritten sign on the door said the air conditioning was broken, which in late August in the Arizona high desert was basically a sign that said, "Abandon all hope." The parking lot was cracked asphalt and sand, with a rusted metal bench along the south wall and a soft drink machine that hummed aggressively as though arguing with itself. Gage pulled in first. The others followed in order. Mason Holt, Cole Barrett, Dex Navarro, Ray Pruitt, Sully Okafor, Pete Withers, and Crank, whose legal name was Gerald Warren, but who hadn't been called Gerald since the George W. Bush administration. 8 bikes. 8 men. 240 combined years of hard living between them, which was a number that sounded impressive and felt like a bruise. Engines off. The sudden silence was enormous, the way silence always was after 2 hours of highway noise. Gage pulled off his helmet and hung it on the handlebar and ran a hand through his hair, which was the color of gunmetal and needed cutting. He was 46 years old and looked like a man who'd spent 46 years earning every year. There was a scar along his jaw from a bar fight in Tucson that he'd lost and would never discuss. There were faded burns on his left forearm from a roadside IED outside Kandahar that he discussed even less. He wore the Iron Vultures cut over a plain black t-shirt the leather worn to a second skin softness at the elbows and collar. His boots were army surplus, steel-toed, resoled twice. He didn't look like someone you approached. Most people didn't. The family sedan parked at the far pump had arrived maybe 10 minutes earlier, judging by the condensation rings still evaporating from the concrete where an ice chest had been set down and moved. A woman was at the pump, one hand shielding her eyes from the glare, watching the iron vultures fill the lot with the barely controlled alarm of someone who'd grown up watching certain kinds of news. She was in her early 30s, brown hair pulled back in a way that suggested the morning had started with more ambition than it was currently delivering. She wore a thin summer blouse, the kind that had been washed too many times, and her shoulders were tight with the particular tension of someone doing math, calculating distance, calculating risk, calculating whether the car doors were locked. Gage noticed her noticing them. He was used to it. He'd stopped being bothered by it somewhere around 2019, or maybe he'd just stopped letting himself feel bothered, which wasn't quite the same thing. "Sully," he said, not loudly. "Yeah. You and Pete get waters. Everybody. It's 104. "Already on it." Mason Holt came up beside him and leaned against the pump island with the careful, unhurried movement of a man who'd learned the hard way that fast moves in public spaces caused problems. Mason was 42, built like a man who'd spent his 20s doing physical labor and his 30s surviving it. He had his brother's name tattooed on the inside of his left wrist, Daniel, in plain block letters, no ornamentation, no elaboration, just the name, like a fact that needed to be stated. "You writing okay?" Mason asked. "I'm writing fine." "That's not what I asked." Gage looked at him. Mason looked back. This was the dynamic. Had been for 8 years since Mason had come out of a VA waiting room in Phoenix, having been told his appointment was canceled for the 3rd consecutive month, and found Gage sitting on the curb outside eating a gas station sandwich and reading, of all things, a paperback Western. They'd talked for 3 hours. Gage had introduced him to the chapter 6 weeks later. Mason was now the sergeant-at-arms, which meant he noticed things and acted on what he noticed. And right now what he'd noticed was that Gage hadn't eaten since Flagstaff, and that the particular set of his jaw had been broadcasting "don't" to everyone within 50 feet for the past hour. "I'm writing fine," Gage said again, and this time it came out softer, which was as close to an admission as either of them needed. The little girl appeared from the far side of the sedan. She was 7 years old or thereabouts. Yellow dress with small white flowers at the collar. Brown hair and 2 loose braids that had started the morning tidy and progressively surrendered. White sneakers with something glittery on the sides. She was carrying a small cardboard box, the kind that might come from a bakery, except that the top was sealed with a piece of masking tape on which someone had written "cookies" in purple marker with the confident orthography of someone who had recently conquered the alphabet. She walked across the parking lot with the complete and total fearlessness of a person who had not yet been taught that the world was dangerous. No hesitation, no sideways glance toward her mother, just purpose. A small body moving across cracked asphalt toward 8 leather-clad men with the assurance of a postal carrier approaching a front door. Nobody moved. It was Cole who saw her first and went completely still, which for Cole was notable because Cole was never completely still. His hand, which had been reaching toward his jacket pocket for his cigarettes, simply stopped. Dex Navarro, who had been explaining something complicated and probably profane to Ray Pruitt, fell silent mid-sentence. Even Crank, who could maintain a running commentary through a thunderstorm, went quiet. The woman at the pump said, "Ember," in a voice that was trying to be calm and failing. The little girl, Ember, didn't stop walking. She came straight to Gage. Not to Mason, who was closer. Not to Sully, who was the least intimidating of the group by virtue of having the kind of face that looked like it belonged on a high school baseball coach. She came to Gage specifically, as though she'd been given his name and coordinates, and she stopped in front of him and held out the cardboard box and said, "We made these this morning, chocolate chip. My mom said the chocolate got a little burnt, but I think they're good anyway." Gage stared at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. He was a man who had done 3 tours, who had sat with dying men and held their hands and told them lies about how everything was going to be okay because that was the only mercy available at the time, who had ridden 20,000 miles of American highway and buried more brothers than any man should have to bury, who had stood in a lawyer's office 12 years ago while his marriage ended and absorbed the information that his daughter Kayla would be living primarily with her mother in Scottsdale, and who had driven home afterward to an apartment that smelled like moving boxes and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes before he trusted his legs to carry him inside. He crouched down. Not fast, not slow. Just down, until he was at eye level with her, his knees making the complaint they always made on cold mornings and hot afternoons. This close, he could see she had a gap between her two front teeth and a small bandage on her left knee in the shape of a cartoon dinosaur. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ember." "I'm Gage." She considered this. "That's a weird name." "Yeah," he said. "It really is." He took the box from her. The masking tape pulled away cleanly. Inside, wrapped in a sheet of wax paper, were 11 homemade chocolate chip cookies in varying states of structural integrity. Some were slightly overdone at the edges. One had been broken in half and placed back together with a kind of optimistic logic that suggested whoever had done it believed the box would keep it from falling apart. They smelled like brown sugar and heat, and the particular sweetness of something made by hand in a kitchen that didn't have a professional oven. Gage held the box for a moment, not taking a cookie. Not yet. He looked up at the woman by the pump. She hadn't moved. Her hand was over her mouth. She was watching him with the expression of someone who had braced for impact and was now processing the fact that it hadn't come. "These are beautiful," he said to Ember. Not to the mother, to the girl. Ember looked very pleased. "I put extra chips in mine," she said, "but they mostly sank to the bottom, so it's the same." Behind Gage, he heard Mason make a sound that might, in another context, have been a laugh. He stood back up, knees complaining again, and turned to face his club. 8 men in Iron Vulture's leather, looking at a little girl with an expression he recognized. It was the expression men made when something reached them that they'd stopped expecting to be reached by. A gap in the armor, a signal getting through on a frequency they'd thought was jammed. "Cookie?" he said. There was a beat of silence. "Don't mind if I do," said Sully, and reached in first. What happened in the next 10 minutes was quiet and unremarkable and entirely unlike anything Gage could have predicted when he'd woken up that morning in a motel room in Flagstaff and lain on the ceiling tiles until the alarm told him to get up. They stood around in the parking lot. They ate cookies, Ember explained, with the authority of a person who has spent significant effort on a project. The technical differences between the cookies that had burned slightly and the ones that hadn't, and which she personally recommended, and why. Crank, who stood 6'3" and had a skull and crossbones patch that he wore unironically, and a voice that sounded like gravel in a cement mixer, crouched beside her and tasted 2 cookies in sequence and rendered a detailed verdict that she clearly found satisfying. The woman from the pump, her name was Naomi Quinn, and she'd driven 600 miles in the past 2 days, and her eyes had the particular flatness of someone running on coffee and something harder to name, crossed the parking lot slowly. Not rushing, not exactly volunteering. The way you approach a situation, you've already decided you can't stop. She stopped a few feet from Gage. "I'm sorry," she said. She does this. I don't know where she gets it." "Nothing to apologize for," Gage said. Naomi looked at him the way people did when they'd already decided who you were and the evidence wasn't cooperating. He'd seen that look 1,000 times in 1,000 configurations, and he'd learned to neither shrink from it nor push back. Just stand in it. Let her revise. "You're on a ride?" she said. "Memorial ride," he said. "Lost a brother last week." The flatness in her eyes shifted toward something more complicated. "I'm sorry," she said again, and this time she meant it differently. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." Ember had migrated toward Mason, who was now sitting on the concrete curb with his long legs stretched in front of him, and she was explaining something to him about the particular properties of chocolate when it got too hot, which was a subject she had clearly given genuine thought to. Mason was listening with the full attention of a man who understood that when children chose to talk to you, the correct response was to listen and not to squander it. Cole Barrett had drifted toward the far end of the building, the way he did when things got quiet. He was leaning against the cinder block wall with his arms crossed, and his cigarette going, staring at the middle distance. Gage watched him for a moment. Cole was the one that worried him most these days. Not because Cole was unstable. Cole was the most tightly wound, stable man Gage had ever known, but because that kind of wound-up stability had a price, and nobody around Cole was sure yet what that price was going to be or when it was going to come due. The sun was moving. The shadow from the awning had shifted. Dex Navarro had wandered inside and come back out with a paper cup of gas station coffee that he was regarding with philosophical resignation. Pete Withers was on his phone, the flat expression of a man receiving news he didn't want but had expected. Ray Pruitt had folded himself into a square of shade and appeared to be either sleeping or meditating, and knowing Ray, it could have been either. It was Crank who broke it first. He did it the way Crank always did things, without social calculation, which was sometimes a problem and sometimes, like now, the only way anything useful got said. "Your little girl walked right at us," he said to Naomi. Not accusatory. Observational, in the way of someone who found it genuinely remarkable. Most adults won't even look at us in a parking lot. Naomi was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't know to be afraid yet," she said. "I don't know if that's good or bad." "Good," said Gage. He said it without thinking, which meant it was true. Naomi looked at him again. "You have kids?" she asked. He felt the question land in the usual place, the sore spot that hadn't healed and probably wasn't going to. "A daughter," he said, 17. "Does she know you're on this ride?" He pulled out his phone. The screen was dark. He turned it face down in his palm without answering, which was its own answer. Naomi didn't push. She had the instinct of someone who understood when a door should stay closed. What she said instead was, "We're going north. My mother's in Prescott. She stopped. Started again. "She's had some health problems, and we're going up to help her for a while." She said it with the particular compression of someone who'd been shortening a complicated story for several days because they no longer had the energy for the full version. "Long drive," Gage said. "Yeah." Ember came back from Mason and inserted herself between the two adults with the complete social confidence of someone who did not recognize the concept of an adult conversation. "Mom," she said, "did you know that Mason was in the Army too?" Naomi blinked, looked at Mason, who had stood back up and was brushing concrete dust off the back of his jeans. "I didn't know that," she said. "2 tours," Mason said. "Infantry." "Gage too," Ember announced, as if she'd known Gage for years and not 17 minutes. "3, Gage said, and looked down at her. "But, how do you know that?" She pointed at his left arm, at the airborne patch above the club insignia. "My grandpa has one of those," she said. "He says it means you jumped out of planes." "It does." She appeared to consider the inherent wisdom of this activity. "On purpose?" "On purpose," he confirmed. "Why?" He thought about it. The real answer was complicated and involved a 20-year-old version of himself that he didn't entirely recognize anymore, full of a particular brand of invincibility that the years had systematically dismantled. What he said seemed important at the time. She thought about this with genuine seriousness. Then she nodded, as though filing it away in a category she'd return to later. The afternoon was building towards something. Gage could feel it the way he felt weather changing. A pressure in the chest, a heightened quality to the air. He didn't know yet what it was. He noticed that 2 other cars had pulled in while they'd been talking. A pickup with a couple in their 60s who'd gotten out and were filling up without looking over, and a minivan with 3 kids visible through the windows who were emphatically looking over, faces pressed to the glass like they were watching something at an aquarium. Cole had moved from the wall and was now standing at the edge of the parking lot, one hand in his pocket, the other holding the cigarette. He was looking at the highway, just watching the road, the way men looked at roads when they were trying to decide if the road was still an option. Gage watched him for a count of 3, then looked away. Some things you couldn't fix by looking at them. "You need anything?" he said to Naomi. "For the road." She seemed surprised by the question, not offended, surprised, the way people were surprised when the version of events they'd prepared for didn't materialize. "We're okay," she said. "I've got water in the cooler. We'll stop for dinner before Prescott." "Road's good up through Chino Valley," Mason offered. No construction that I know of. Thanks. Sully came back from inside the station with a paper bag and pressed it toward Naomi without preamble. They had those little snack cracker packs, he said. The ones with the peanut butter. Kids go crazy for those. He said kids in the way of a man who had specific knowledge of children, and in fact Sully had 3 daughters between 8 and 14, who he described with the besotted helplessness of a man who understood he had been completely outmaneuvered by his own family and was grateful for it. Naomi started to protest. Please, Sully said, and there was enough in the single word that she stopped. She took the bag. Thank you, she said, and this time it came out without the compression. Just the bare words, unguarded. Ember was looking at the cookies box, which Gage was still holding. There were 4 left. He realized with a start that he hadn't eaten one yet. You didn't have one, Ember said. Saving it, he said. Which wasn't quite true. The truth was more complicated and had to do with the fact that accepting small gifts required a certain kind of openness he'd been running low on, and he was still calibrating. You should eat it now, she said. They're better when they're still kind of warm. He looked at the remaining cookies. Then he took one, the broken one, the one that had been placed back together with such optimism. And he ate it in 2 bites, and she watched him with the expectant expression of someone whose work was being evaluated. It was, he had to admit, a very good cookie. The chocolate was slightly darker than ideal at the edges, the way she'd warned. The center was soft, the way good cookies were soft, the way the best versions of things were soft at the center, even when they were hard at the edge. Good? She asked. Real good, he said. She beamed with the total, uncomplicated joy of a child whose effort has been validated, and something in Gage's chest moved in a way he wasn't entirely prepared for. A shift. Tectonic and small and impossible to explain, the way the most significant things were always impossible to explain. He handed the box to Mason. Pass it around. It was Ray who first pulled a chair from the edge of the awning and set it near the group, a plastic lawn chair that had clearly been sitting outside through several seasons and had the structural integrity of a suggestion. Naomi sat in it because it was offered, and because she'd been driving for 6 hours and her back hurt, and because something about the situation had stopped feeling dangerous several minutes ago and started feeling simply strange, and then, slowly, something almost like restful. Ember sat on the concrete beside the chair and laid her head against Naomi's knee and looked at the bikes with the pure aesthetic appreciation of someone encountering a new category of beautiful thing. Which one is yours? She asked Gage. He pointed. The Road King. Black tank with the Iron Vulture's insignia. A bird with a 6-inch wingspan on each side, mid-dive, rendered in gunmetal and red by a tattoo artist in Tempe named Luce, who'd been doing the chapter's artwork for 15 years. The chrome was dulled from the desert dust. The leather of the saddlebags was cracked in one corner from a fall in the rain outside Albuquerque in 2021. The black one? Yeah. They're all black, she said, not unkindly. A few of the men made sounds that were definitely laughs. Mine's the one with the bird, he said. Oh, she studied it. It looks like it's going somewhere. Always is, he said. Naomi's hand had moved to Ember's shoulder, the automatic touch of a parent who keeps tabs on their child the way pilots keep tabs on altitude, not always consciously, but never completely without awareness. She was watching the group now with something different than fear. Not exactly trust, something more provisional than trust, but in the same general direction. It was into this moment, the cooling afternoon, the soft drink machine's argument with itself, the highway sound distant and steady, that Mason asked the question he probably shouldn't have asked, and asked anyway because Mason had never fully grasped the difference between honest and diplomatic. Where's her dad? He said to Naomi. He said it low, not for the group, not a conversation piece. Just a question. Naomi was quiet for a beat. South, she said. Tucson. Mason processed that. Tucson to Prescott, with her mother sick and the car packed, without stopping to pick anyone up from Tucson. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. Some geography told stories all by itself. We separated 8 months ago, Naomi said, And she said it to the middle distance rather than to anyone specifically, the way people sometimes needed to say things that had been sitting in their mouths too long without a real destination. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody did anything terrible. It just stopped working, and we held on past the point where holding on was helping anyone. The kind of honesty that comes out of exhaustion. Gage recognized it. He'd said similar things in motel rooms at 2 a.m. to people he barely knew, because sometimes you ran out of the energy to maintain the curated version. "I'm sorry," he said. "I keep telling myself it's better," she said. "Some days I even believe it." Cole had come back to the edge of the group. He stood a little outside the natural circle, the way he always positioned himself, present but with an exit available. His cigarette was done. He was rolling the filter between his fingers, the unconscious fidget of someone who needed to do something with their hands when their mind got loud. Gage looked at him. Cole looked back. In 11 years of club brotherhood, Gage had developed a fairly fluent vocabulary of Cole's silences, and this one was the specific silence of a man who had something to say and was running the cost-benefit on saying it. Cole said, "My mother raised 4 of us alone." He said it to Naomi, not to the group. "After my dad left. She did it without asking anyone for a damn thing, because asking was what weak people did, which was wrong, but it was what she believed." He paused. She died of a stroke at 59. Another pause. I'm just saying, ask for things." It landed in the group the way things landed when Cole said them, which was quietly and with full weight. Cole wasn't a man who decorated what he said. Naomi looked at him. Cole looked at the ground, then back at her, steady. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said, and that was the whole conversation. Ember had gotten up at some point and wandered toward the bikes, and Crank was now doing what Crank did with the children of strangers everywhere they stopped, narrating the technical details of his motorcycle with the enthusiasm and vocabulary of a man who'd forgotten that 7-year-olds existed in a different conceptual universe than he did. She was nodding along with the expression of someone who was following roughly 20% of what was being said and finding that sufficient. The sun had moved another degree. The shadow from the awning had shifted, and the temperature had dropped from unreasonable to merely hostile, which in Arizona August counted as evening approaching. Dex came out of the station with a second coffee and handed it to Naomi without asking, and she accepted it the same way she'd accepted the crackers, with the particular grace of someone who'd stopped protesting small mercies. It was Pete Withers who said it. Pete, who was the quietest man in the club, who'd been a trauma nurse for 8 years before a shift he never fully described, had finally cost him something he couldn't pay twice. Pete, who had the kind of eyes that looked like they'd seen the inside of things most people only read about. "You need us to follow you to Prescott?" he said to Naomi. The question sat there. She opened her mouth and closed it, and then said, No, you don't have to do that." "Not what I asked," Pete said. The afternoon held its breath. "I'll be okay," she said. Her voice was smaller than she probably wanted it to be. "All right," Pete said. Just that. An acknowledgement, not a withdrawal. Gage was watching all of it with the particular dual attention of a road captain who was simultaneously present in a moment and cataloging it, keeping the inventory of his club the way he always did, tracking the subtle signals, the micro-adjustments, the invisible emotional weather of 8 men who didn't know how to be easy with the world except in each other's company. He was watching Cole. Cole had moved once more. Not away this time. He'd moved closer to the group, the way he did when something pulled him back from whatever edge he was standing near. He was standing next to Ray now, and Ray had opened one eye and looked at him, and then closed it again, which was Ray's way of acknowledging that he saw you and wasn't going to make it weird. And then Ember came back from the bikes. She came back with the specific purposefulness she seemed to have for everything, and she stopped in front of Gage, and she looked up at him with the wide, unfiltered assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to veil her observations, and she said, "Are you sad?" The question went through him like cold water, not because it was unexpected, though it was, not because he didn't have an answer. He'd had the answer for years, he just didn't use it, because it had been asked without strategy, without agenda, without the careful approach that adults used when they wanted to extract emotional information without appearing to want it. She'd just looked at him and seen something and named it, the way children did before they learned that naming things made you responsible for them. The group went quiet in that particular way. Not pointed, not performative, just the natural quiet of people who understood that something important was in the air. Gage looked at Ember for a long moment. Then he said, "Yeah, kid, I guess I am." She reached into the box. There was one cookie left, the other half of the broken one, the half he hadn't eaten. She held it out. He took it. "Broken cookies still taste the same," she said, with the gravity of someone delivering wisdom they'd earned from personal experience. "Yeah," he said. "They do." He ate it. It was still soft at the center. The desert light was going gold now, the long, horizontal gold of late afternoon in the southwest that turned everything cinematic whether you wanted it to be or not. The bikes caught the light on their chrome and threw it back. Naomi's hair, escaping from its tie, caught it too. The awning threw a deep shadow across half the parking lot. Somewhere south of them, a truck's air brakes went off, the sound carrying farther than it should have in the cooling air. Gage looked at the cookie box in his hands. Empty now. He looked at his dead phone, which he'd put back in his jacket pocket. He thought about Kayla. 17, which meant she'd been 5 when he'd come back from the last deployment, and 6 when Gage and her mother had determined that whatever they'd been building had been damaged beyond the point of livability, and 7 when the apartment started and the every other weekend started, and the gradual cellular drift that he told himself was temporary and had not been temporary had started. 17, which meant she would leave for college in a year. And the math of that, the arithmetic of the remaining time, hit him in a way it hadn't before, not as abstraction, as countdown. He turned the phone over in his palm. Mason was watching him, not saying anything, just watching, the way Mason did. Cole was watching the highway again, but differently than before. The set of his shoulders had changed. Some fraction of the wound-up tension had released, almost invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. He'd said the thing about his mother. He'd said the thing that cost him something to say, and the saying of it had taken a small toll and returned a small something. That was the exchange. That was how it worked. Naomi was standing now, brushing the concrete dust from her slacks, the signal of preparation. She looked at Ember with the expression of a mother who knows they need to leave and is giving themselves one more minute. "We should get back on the road," she said. Gage nodded. "Road's good through Chino Valley," he said again, because he wanted to say something useful, and useful was what he had. She gathered Ember, who said goodbye to each man in turn with a solemnity and completeness that suggested she had been raised to believe that goodbyes were important enough to do properly. She shook Crank's hand, which Crank accepted with more formality than he'd shown anything in recent memory. She told Sully the crackers were a good choice. She told Pete she liked his jacket. She told Ray he could sleep later because there were things to look at. She told Dex his coffee smelled like camping, which Dex appeared to take as a compliment. She came to Cole last. Cole looked at her. His face did something complicated that he didn't try to stop. "You're all right, kid," he said. "You too," she said, which was entirely the right response. Then she came back to Gage. She looked at him for a moment with those direct, dark eyes, the gap between her front teeth, the dinosaur bandage on her knee. "Will you remember us?" she asked. He crouched back down. His knees didn't complain this time. "Every day," he said, and he meant it in a way he couldn't explain and didn't need to. She reached out and patted his arm, the one with the burns, with a complete absence of self-consciousness. Just a pat, a small hand on old scarring. Then she turned and walked back to the car with her mother, climbing into the back seat with the neat determination of a child who has said what she came to say and considers the matter settled. The sedan pulled out of the lot and turned north onto Route 89, and Gage watched it go until it was a shape in the distance, and then a heat shimmer, and then nothing. Behind him, the club was quiet. Then Crank said, in his gravel and cement voice, "I need another coffee. Somebody give me money." And just like that, the spell moved sideways into something more livable. Gage stood up, looked at his phone. The screen was still dark. He pressed the button and the screen woke up and showed him the lock screen photo. It was Kayla at 14, standing in front of the Grand Canyon on the trip he'd actually managed. The two of them with the wind-up and the canyon behind them, and her laughing at something he'd said that he couldn't remember anymore, but that had been enough to make her laugh. He had 17 unread texts. He had 3 missed calls, none from Kayla. He had a voicemail from his chapter president, 2 from his mechanic about the bike's rear suspension, and 1 from a number he didn't recognize with a 602 area code. He scrolled to Kayla's name in his contacts. The last text exchange was 3 weeks old. He'd sent 3. She'd replied to the first one with 2 words, "I know." The subsequent 2 he'd sent had been read and not answered. He stood in the parking lot of a broken-down gas station on Route 89, holding his phone, and the desert light kept doing what it did, which was turn everything honest. He pressed call. It rang. Once, twice. And on the 3rd ring, something went wrong, not with the call, but with the world, because Mason's hand landed hard on his shoulder, and Mason's voice, which didn't do alarm, was doing something close to it. Gage. He looked up. Cole wasn't at the building's edge where he'd been. Cole wasn't in the parking lot. Cole's bike was still in the row, exactly where he'd parked it, but Cole, he went around the back of the building, Dex said. He was standing at the corner, looking around it. He's sitting out there in the dirt, man. He's not... Dex stopped. He's crying. The phone was still ringing in Gage's hand. He canceled the call. He looked at Mason. Mason's eyes said, "Go." Gage put the phone in his pocket and walked toward the back of the building, and whatever he was going to find back there, whatever Cole had been carrying since Trey's funeral, since 2 deployments, since his mother's stroke at 59, since all the silent years of maintaining a stability that had a price no one had calculated, was either going to break something irreparably or begin, at last, to crack open in a way that might actually let something out. The desert didn't care about anyone's feelings, but Gage Mercer did, and what he found behind that gas station, in the dying light of an Arizona afternoon, was going to change the shape of everything that came next, for Cole, for the club, and for Gage himself, in ways he couldn't see yet from where he was standing. He rounded the corner and stopped. Cole Barrett was sitting in the dirt. Not collapsed, not crumpled. Sitting with his back against the cinder-block wall of the gas station, like a man who had chosen this specific piece of ground and intended to stay on it, his long legs drawn up, forearms on his knees, head down. His shoulders were moving. Not violently, just that small rhythmic movement of a man breathing through something that required conscious effort to breathe through. Gage stood at the corner of the building and looked at him. The back of the station faced nothing. A stretch of scrub and hardpan that ran flat until it hit a low ridge about 2 miles out, the ridge going purple in the last of the afternoon light. No road back here. No sound except the wind moving through the brush and the distant mechanical indifference of the soft drink machine on the other side of the wall. The ground was pale caliche studded with bits of quartz that caught the light like teeth. Cole didn't look up. He knew someone was there. He always knew. Gage walked over and sat down beside him. Not close. 2 feet of desert between them, which was the right distance. He put his back against the same wall, stretched his legs out, and looked at the same nothing Cole was looking at. They sat like that for a while. The wind moved. A hawk went over, high and slow, the kind of flight that looked effortless from below and was anything but. "I'm not going to do anything," Cole said. His voice was rough, the roughness of crying that had been held back until the holding had its own cost. "I just need everybody to know that." "I know that," Gage said. "Mason's probably got half the club ready to come around this corner. I told them to stay put." A beat. "You didn't have time to tell them anything." "Mason knows," Gage said. Cole didn't answer that. He pulled a cigarette from his jacket and lit it, and the click of the lighter was enormous in the quiet. He smoked for a moment, the exhale going sideways in the wind. "It was Trey's voice," he said, "at the service. When they played that recording, his sister had him laughing at something at somebody's barbecue. I don't even know when it was taken. That laugh." He stopped. He had this specific laugh. It was too big for him, you know. Kid was 28 years old, and he had this laugh like a man twice his size. He took another drag. "I keep hearing it." Gage nodded. "And then that little girl today," Cole said, "with her damn cookies." He said it without bitterness, with something more like wonder. She didn't look at us and see what everybody else sees. No, Gage agreed. What does everybody else see? Gage looked at the ridge. Damage, he said. Cole laughed, short and dry and real. Yeah. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, the unself-conscious gesture of a man who'd stopped worrying about being seen. I called my therapist 6 weeks ago, left a message. She never called back. Gage turned his head. VA contract expired, Cole said. They reassigned her caseload. I got a letter. Standard form letter, couple paragraphs. Sorry for the inconvenience. He held the cigarette and looked at it. 14 years of service, 2 deployments. And I get a form letter telling me my therapist is gone and I can call a hotline. The bitterness in that last sentence was the clean, cold bitterness of a specific injustice. Not self-pity, not catastrophizing, just the statement of a fact that was genuinely, verifiably wrong. Gage pulled out his own phone, still Kayla's name on the screen from the canceled call. He locked it and put it back. Why didn't you tell me? Because you've been carrying Trey for a week straight, and Dobie and Marcus before that, and you haven't slept, and your kid won't call you back. Cole looked at him sidelong. You're not exactly a man with bandwidth to spare right now. I'm your road captain. You're also a person, Cole said. Those two things are allowed to conflict. Gage absorbed that. It wasn't wrong. He just didn't know what to do with it being right. I'm going to find you someone, he said. Civilian practice, not VA. The chapter will cover it. Gage, that's not a negotiation. Cole was quiet for a moment, then, all right. They sat for another minute in the dirt behind a gas station in the Arizona desert, 2 men in Iron Vulture's leather, with the hawk long gone and the light going golden, and the day having done more to them than days usually did. Then Cole stood up, and Gage stood up, and they walked back around the corner to where the rest of the club was waiting with the particular studied casualness of men who were absolutely paying attention and absolutely pretending they weren't. Crank was the only one who met Cole's eyes directly. He gave him a single nod, the kind that didn't require an answer and didn't ask for one. Cole gave him one back. That was all that needed to happen. They mounted up 20 minutes later, in the last real light of the day, and pulled back onto Route 89 heading north toward the motel outside Prescott, where they'd booked rooms for the night. 8 bikes in formation, the highway running true and long. The desert opening out on both sides into the blue-purple dark of the approaching evening, and the headlights catching the road markings in quick white flashes, rhythm like a pulse. Gage rode point. He always rode point. He thought about the phone call he hadn't finished making. He thought about the cookie, soft at the center. He thought, tomorrow. The motel was called the Desert Star Inn, a name that implied more ambition than the physical structure could support. 12 rooms in a single-story horseshoe around a parking lot, ice machine at one end, vending machines at the other, a small office with a light on behind frosted glass. The pool had been drained. Someone had painted the bottom of it turquoise at some point in the past, and the paint was now cracked and lifting at the edges like old skin. They'd booked 5 rooms, Gage solo, Mason and Cole sharing, Dex and Ray, Pete and Sully, Crank alone, because Crank's nighttime behavior was a documented hazard to anyone in the immediate vicinity, and the club had learned this the hard way in a Motel 6 outside Albuquerque 3 years ago. The parking lot filled with Harleys and the sound of 8 men dismounting, the creak of leather and the pop of joints, and the particular grunts of physical exhaustion that men made when they stopped performing not being tired. Bags came off saddlebags, keys found pockets. Pete and Sully were already discussing where to get food, the discussion having the low-grade argumentative quality of men who agreed on 80% of things and chose to live in the other 20. Gage stood at his door and turned the key and looked at the room for a moment before going in. Single bed, 2 pillows, a low dresser with a television he wouldn't turn on, a window, AC unit that was already running and producing sound without meaningfully affecting the temperature. The bathroom light was on from the housekeeper's cleaning visit. The small bedside lamp threw a yellow circle on the wall. He set his bag down, sat on the edge of the bed, took out the phone. This time he didn't look at Kayla's name for a long time. He just pressed call and waited, and the phone rang twice, and then, "Dad." Her voice, not hostile, not warm, just present, which was more than he'd had in 3 months, and more than he'd let himself believe he was going to get when he'd pressed the call button. "Hey," he said. A pause. Not a hanging up pause. A recalibrating pause. "Are you okay?" she asked, which was, he recognized, her way of asking why he was calling without asking why he was calling. "Yeah," he said. Yeah. We did the ride for Trey today." "I know. Mason texted me." That landed somewhere complicated. Mason had texted Kayla. Not behind his back. Mason had been communicating with Kayla on and off since she was 12. Because Mason was the kind of person who showed up for people consistently whether or not they asked him to, and Kayla had apparently found that easier to accept from someone who wasn't trying to be her father. "He didn't tell me that," Gage said. "He wouldn't," she said. A beat. Outside his window, he could hear the club in the parking lot, Crank's voice carrying the specific rhythm of Pete and Sully's ongoing disagreement, the sound of someone's boots on the asphalt, the faint hiss of the ice machine. "Kayla," he said. "Yeah. He stopped. Started again because the first sentence had been heading somewhere careful and curated, and he was tired enough that careful and curated took more than he had. "I've been doing it wrong. I know I have. I call and I say the right things, and I ask how school is, and I don't—" He put his free hand on the back of his neck. "I don't actually ask anything real, and I know that's why you stopped answering." Silence. "And I don't have a good reason," he continued. "I have reasons, but they're not good enough to keep doing what I've been doing." More silence. Then she said, "I didn't stop answering because of what you said." He waited. "I stopped answering because of what you didn't say." Her voice was 17 and exhausted and older than 17 and exactly like her mother around the eyes when she was working something out. "You never say anything real, Dad. You check in, like I'm a status update." The words were precise and deserved, and they landed in the exact place they were aimed at. "You're right," he said. A long pause. Long enough that he thought he might have lost her. Then, "Okay." That was all, just okay. But it was a door held open instead of closed, and he was experienced enough with doors to know the difference. "Can I call you tomorrow?" he said. "Actually call, not check in." A pause that felt like consideration. "Yeah," she said. "Call afternoon. I have practice in the morning." "What sport?" A beat, a small one. "Soccer," she said, in the tone of someone reminding a person of something they should have known. "Right," he said. "Right, soccer. Since when?" "Since 2 years ago, Dad." He closed his eyes. "Okay," he said. "Afternoon, tomorrow." "Okay." They hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand and the window AC running its futile effort and the yellow lamp making its small circle on the wall. And he thought that this was what you got when you'd spent 11 years leading a club and 3 years before that leading men through places that actively wanted to kill them, and 12 years before that being the kind of son and husband and then ex-husband who showed up physically and checked out emotionally. You got a 17-year-old who knew the difference between being present and being there, and who required the latter. He put the phone down. He slept. Gage woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of Mason's fist on his door. Not frantic. 3 hard knocks, even tempo. Mason's knock. But 3 a.m. was 3 a.m., and Mason's knock at 3 a.m. meant something had moved. He was up and at the door in 12 seconds, the boots on because he slept with them close. He opened it. Mason was fully dressed. Behind him, the parking lot was dark except for the orange neon of the motel sign and the single functioning lamp near the ice machine. The bikes were where they'd been left. 5 of them. 3 were gone. Gage looked at the empty spaces. Looked at Mason. "Who?" "Dex, Ray, and Crank," Mason said. "Crank's phone goes to voicemail. Dex texted me 40 minutes ago. 1 word, issue." Gage's jaw tightened. "What kind of issue?" "That's all he sent? That's all I've got." They stood in the cold desert air for a moment, Cold, because the desert did this. Went from 104 to 58 between afternoon and 3 a.m. without apology, and Gage ran the possibilities, and none of them were good, and one of them was very bad. Dex Navarro had history in Prescott, not club history, personal history, the kind that predated his Iron Vultures patch by 6 years. He'd grown up here, or close enough to hear that here counted. He'd left at 22 and come back periodically the way men came back to places that had marked them, looking for something, never entirely sure if they wanted to find it. His sister lived in Prescott. Elena Navarro, 34, 2 kids, a husband named Curtis Briggs, who Dex had described, in the compressed vocabulary of a man choosing his words carefully, as a problem. Gage said, "Elena?" Mason nodded once. He was already moving toward his bike. They took the highway into Prescott at speed, not reckless but fast, the night air cold and sharp against exposed skin, the headlights cutting the desert dark. Gage's phone had a text from Dex now. An address on Granite Street, on the east side of the city, and under the address, "Don't call the cops, we've got it. Just come." The "we've got it" was the part that worried him. Granite Street was a residential block of mid-century ranch homes, the kind of neighborhood that had been working class when it was built and was still working class in the specific way of a place that had never quite turned the corner. It had been promised it would turn. Pickup trucks in driveways, a chain-link fence with a dog behind it that went off when the bikes passed, a house on the left with a light on in the kitchen window, which at 3:40 a.m. was either insomnia or something else. They found the bikes parked half a block down from a tan ranch house, with a cracked concrete walk and a truck in the driveway with a dented rear panel. Crank's bike and Dex's and Ray's, all three nosed toward the curb with the front wheels turned, the way they parked when they thought they might need to leave quickly. Crank was standing on the sidewalk with his arms crossed, which Crank did when he was restraining himself from doing something he decided he shouldn't do. Ray was on the front step of the tan house, sitting on the stoop with a coffee cup that Gage suspected hadn't come from inside that house. And from inside the house, even at street volume, even through the closed front door, voices. One of them was Dex. The other was not happy. Gage dismounted, looked at Crank. Talk. "Elena called Dex about 2 hours ago," Crank said, keeping his voice low, his eyes on the house. "Her husband came home drunk and it got loud. Not the first time. She didn't call the cops because last time she called the cops, Curtis got taken in and she ended up with 3 days of something worse after they let him out." He paused. "Dex called us." "Where are the kids?" "Neighbors, apparently. She sends them to the neighbor when it starts. She's done this enough times to have a system." The flatness in his voice was the particular flatness of someone describing something that made them furious, and whom fury would not currently help. "Curtis is still inside?" "Dex went in. Dex has been in there 40 minutes. Crank looked at him. "He's handling it." "He shouldn't be alone with it." "No," Crank said. "He shouldn't." Gage walked up the path. Ray on the stoop stood up without comment and stepped aside. The front door was not quite closed, left deliberately ajar, Gage recognized, so sound could travel out to the men on the sidewalk. A failsafe. Dex's practical intelligence, always working even under pressure. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was small and tight, the furniture of a family operating on the edge of what they could afford and maintaining it with the dignity of people who understood that pride in your space was one of the things that couldn't be taken unless you let it. There were drawings on the refrigerator in the kitchen at the end of the hall. Kids' drawings, the kind with outsized suns and small square houses. A coloring book on the coffee table, half finished. 2 small shoes by the door, one knocked on its side. Dex was in the living room. He was standing with his back to the front window, arms at his sides, which was Dex's version of restraint, hands visible, posture deliberately non-threatening, the practiced stance of a man who understood that the dynamic in this room required specific geometry. He was 39 years old, dark-haired, built like someone who'd done construction work before and after whatever the military had done to him, and his face right now had the controlled expression of someone performing calm with considerable effort. Curtis Briggs was on the couch. He was 41, thickening at the middle, still wearing a work shirt with a company logo on the pocket, the shirt untucked. His eyes were the eyes of a man who'd been drinking since after dinner and hadn't stopped when he should have. He wasn't loud now. The loudness had apparently burned through in the 40 minutes before Gage arrived, but the residue of it was in the air, the way smoke stayed in a room after a fire was out. Elena was in the kitchen doorway. She was Dex's sister, and you could see it, the same dark hair, the same set of the jaw. She had her arms crossed over her chest, not in anger, but in the self-holding way of a woman who'd been managing something draining for a long time and had gotten very good at managing it and was very tired of being good at it. There was a bruise starting under her left eye that was fresh enough to still be swelling. Gage looked at the bruise, looked at Dex. Dex's eyes said, "I know. Not yet." Curtis looked at Gage. His eyes did the calculation they always did, the sizing up of a new element, and came back with the specific wrong answer of a drunk man who decided the new element was something he could manage. "Who's this?" he said. "Friend of Dex's," Gage said. He kept his voice flat and even. No edge in it, no performance. Just a statement of fact delivered from a position that didn't require edge because the position itself was sufficient. Curtis looked at the Iron Vulture's cut. "Another one," he said. "Another one," Gage confirmed. Curtis processed this. The arithmetic of the situation was even less favorable than it had been 40 minutes ago, and some part of him was doing the math and not liking the result. He looked at Elena, who had not moved from the kitchen doorway, and what was in his face in that moment, not anger anymore, but something smaller and more rotten, an assertion of a claim he didn't actually own, turned Gage's stomach in a way that had nothing to do with nausea. "Elena," Dex said. He said it quietly. "Go next door, get the kids, and stay there tonight." "Dex." "Elena." Just her name again, the same quiet. "Please." She looked at her brother for a long moment. Then she looked at Gage, the assessment of a woman deciding whether the room's new variable was safe. She took his measure in 3 seconds. Not his size, not his cut, but his eyes. And whatever she found there was enough. She uncrossed her arms, picked up a small bag that had been sitting by the kitchen doorway, pre-packed, the bag of a woman who had indeed done this enough times to have a system. She walked toward the front door without looking at Curtis. Curtis stood up. Gage stepped sideways, not fast, just into the line. Curtis stopped. The two men looked at each other. "Sit down," Gage said. Curtis's jaw worked. The drunk bravado and the sober calculation were fighting each other behind his eyes, and the sober calculation was losing, but it was still there, still running, still counting bodies and doing the math. He sat down. Elena walked out. The front door clicked behind her. The three of them, Gage, Dex, Curtis, stayed in the arrangement for a moment that had the suspended quality of something that could still go several ways, though the number of ways it could go had narrowed considerably from where it had started. Curtis said, "You can't make me leave my own house." "No," Gage said, "we can't." "Then what?" "We're not here to make you do anything," Gage said. "We're here because Elena called her brother, and her brother called us, and we came. That's the whole story." Curtis looked at Dex. "You brought a bunch of—" "Choose your next word carefully," Dex said. He said it without heat, flatly, like reading a temperature. Curtis chose not to finish the sentence. Gage looked around the room, the children's drawings on the refrigerator, the coloring book, the small shoes. He looked at the bruise he'd seen under Elena's eye, fading now behind the door she'd walked out of. "You have kids," he said to Curtis. It was not a question. Curtis looked at him. "2 kids," Gage said, "and they have a system. Your wife has a system for getting them out of the house before things get bad. You know what that means, right? It means they know. Kids always know." He paused. "I had a daughter who knew things she shouldn't have had to know at an age she shouldn't have had to know them. And I'm still paying for that. 11 years later, I'm still paying for it." He kept his voice even. No drama, just true. "You're going to keep paying for this for a long time. The question is whether it gets worse before you stop." Curtis stared at him. The drunk calculation had gone quieter. Something else was running now. Something more complicated. The kind of reckoning that happened when a man who wasn't entirely beyond reach got pushed into the corner of himself where the thing he'd done lived. "Get out of my house," Curtis said. but it came out hollow. The demand of a man who'd already lost the argument. "We're leaving," Gage said, "and you're not going next door tonight." "You can't." "I'm not telling you what you can do," Gage said. "I'm telling you what you're not going to do. Because if you go next door, we come back. And the conversation we have then won't look like this one." It wasn't a threat exactly. It was information. The same tone he'd used to give soldiers information about what the terrain ahead looked like. This is what is. This is what follows from what is. Plan accordingly. Curtis sat on the couch and said nothing. They walked out. Dex pulled the door closed behind them, not hard, just shut. He stood on the step for a moment with his head down and his hands on his knees and breathed. 1 breath, 2, 3. Then he straightened up. "Thank you," he said. "Don't," Gage said. "I'm saying it anyway." Gage looked at him. In the orange neon spill of the motel district light that carried this far into the neighborhood, Dex's face showed the particular cost of 40 minutes in that room. Not fear, Dex didn't do fear in the traditional configuration, but something adjacent. The toll of holding himself in check against a situation that had his sister's face in it and required him to stay geometric and calm and measured when everything in him was calibrated for a different response. "She's been here 2 years, Dex said. I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was that bad." He looked at the house. "She didn't tell me." "They don't," Mason said from behind him. He'd come up from the sidewalk while Gage was inside. "Not until they can't hold it anymore." "I should have pushed." "Yeah," Mason said, not softening it. "Probably." Dex looked at him, and what moved across his face was the exact shape of a man acknowledging a fact he'd been avoiding because acknowledging it meant accepting responsibility for the time that had already passed. It was not a comfortable shape to hold. "She needs to get out," Dex said. "Out of this house, out of this situation. She's got nowhere to go." "She's got you," Gage said. "I'm in Phoenix. You're her brother," Gage said. "Figure out the rest." The rest of the club had come off their bikes by now, ranging across the sidewalk in the small hours of the Arizona night. Cole had his arms crossed and his eyes on the house, the still watching posture of a man monitoring a threat. Pete was on his phone. Gage assumed making a call he had the professional knowledge to make. Because Pete was Pete. Ray had finished his coffee and was looking at the sky with the expression of a man for whom the stars were personally significant. Sully was next to him, saying nothing, which was what Sully did when he was thinking hard. They stood there on Granite Street at 4 a.m., with the cold air moving through the chain-link fence, and the dog 2 properties over still occasionally weighing in on the situation. And the conversation that happened next was the kind of conversation that clubs had at 4 a.m. in the aftermath of something. Factual and necessary and not quite comfortable. Pete said from the edge of the group, "She needs to file. There's a clinic downtown that does emergency orders. I've sent people there before." "She won't," Dex said. "She might," Pete said, "if someone she trusts goes with her." Dex looked at him. "I can go with her," Pete said. Not volunteering in the dramatic sense, just noting what was possible and available. "Tomorrow morning, if she'll have me." The group was quiet. Then Crank said in his gravel voice, "You should have told us sooner." He was looking at Dex. Not accusatory. It wasn't Crank's nature to be accusatory, just direct. The way a man was direct when he meant for something to land. "That's what this is for." Dex looked at the ground. "I know. We don't come to each other with things because they're convenient," Crank said. "We come because it's what we do. You held this for..." He stopped. "How long have you known it was bad?" A pause. 8 months, Dex said. Crank absorbed this. 8 months, he said. "I thought she was handling it." "She was handling it with a system for getting her kids out of the house," Crank said. "That's not handling it, that's surviving it." The distinction landed in the group the way it was meant to, not as criticism of Elena, who had done what she could with what she had, but as the definition of a line that the club understood collectively and intuitively. Handling it and surviving it were 2 different countries, and the second one was not acceptable on their watch. Gage said nothing. He let the conversation land where it was landing. He was thinking about something else. He was thinking about Naomi Quinn in a car on her way to Prescott, going to her sick mother's house. about the particular compression of her voice when she'd said health problems, the compression of someone who'd been shortening a longer story for days, about the way Ember had fallen asleep against her mother's knee in the plastic chair, and about the fact that Naomi was in the same city tonight, at her mother's house, managing something she'd been holding alone for longer than she'd told anyone. He was thinking about how patterns repeated, about how many times in one day a person could run into the same story wearing different faces. He was thinking about the form letter Cole's VA therapist had sent, about the 3 consecutive canceled appointments, about the way institutions processed human beings through systems optimized for volume rather than need, and about the specific grinding damage that caused over years, not dramatic damage, not the kind that made news, but the kind that showed up at 3 a.m. in a gas station parking lot, or on a cinder block wall behind a gas station, or in a living room in Prescott at 4 a.m. with a bruise under a woman's eye and 2 small pairs of shoes by the door. He was thinking about the broken cookie, and about the girl who'd given it to him, and about what she'd said. Broken cookies still taste the same. He stood on Granite Street and let all of it run through him, and then he sorted it into what he could act on tonight and what would have to wait for morning, and then he did what road captains did. He made a decision. "Dex," he said. Dex looked up. "Go be with your sister, tonight, however she needs that to look." A pause. "And the club?" "Goes back to the motel, sleeps. We deal with the rest tomorrow." Dex held his gaze for a moment, looking for something, and then found it and nodded. "Pete," Gage said. "Yeah." "First thing tomorrow. You and Dex. The clinic." "Understood." "And Cole, I'm going to need you to make a call for me in the morning. Number I'll give you. It's a contact at a legal aid organization in Phoenix. A woman named Judith Baranowski. She handles protective order referrals. She owes me a favor from a situation 3 years ago I won't get into." He paused. "She's good, and she's fast." Cole looked at him with an expression that said he was filing all of this away. "All right." Gage looked at the group. 8 men on a sidewalk at 4 a.m. 8 men who'd started the day at a gas station with the little girl's cookies and who'd ended up here, because that was the thing about days. They didn't stay what they started as. They accumulated. They compounded. "Go sleep," he said. They went. He was the last one to leave Granite Street. He stood for a moment outside the tan ranch house and looked at the lit kitchen window, the same warm yellow light that had been on when they'd arrived. He thought about what lived behind it. The coloring book, the small shoes, the drawings on the refrigerator with their oversized sons. He thought about whether that kitchen light would still be on in 6 months, and whether the shoes would still be there, and whether the system Elena had built, the neighbor, the pre-packed bag, the protocol, would still be the primary infrastructure of her daily life. He thought about the form letter, about the canceled appointments, about Dex carrying 8 months of this alone, about Cole sitting in the dirt, about Kayla and soccer, and since 2 years ago, Dad. He walked back to his bike and rode back through the dark city and pulled into the Desert Star Inn at 4:20 and sat on the edge of his bed and looked at his hands for a long time. His phone lit up. Unknown number. 602 area code, the one he'd noticed earlier and not called back, at 4:20 in the morning. He looked at it, didn't answer, watched it ring through to voicemail. He waited. The voicemail notification came. He pressed play. The voice on the message was a man's voice, older, the particular register of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where things were decided. It was 3 sentences. Short, direct, and by the time the 3rd sentence had finished, Gage was standing up off the bed with his heart running at a different rate than it had been 30 seconds earlier. Because the voice said a name he hadn't heard in 4 years. A name that belonged to a man he'd believed was gone, out of the state, out of the reach of anything that could come back and damage what was his. A name that changed everything about the next 48 hours. He played the message again, then a 3rd time. Then he called Mason. Mason answered on the first ring, because Mason had never been asleep. "Get dressed," Gage said, "and wake Cole. Don't wake the others yet, just you 2. A beat. "What happened?" Gage said the name. The silence that followed was the silence of a man who recognized it. "How?" Mason said. "That's what we're going to find out," Gage said. "Get dressed." He was already pulling on his jacket when the knock came. Not Mason's three-knock rhythm, too fast for Mason to have gotten from his room to Gage's door in the time since Gage had hung up. A different knock, sharp and low, the knock of someone who knew which room they were looking for and had been standing outside it for longer than was comfortable. Gage opened the door. The man standing in the orange neon shadow of the Desert Star Inn parking lot was someone he had not seen in 4 years and had not expected to see again in the state of Arizona. And the look on his face was not hostile and not friendly, but something in between that was, in its own way, more alarming than either. "We need to talk," the man said. "Who are you?" Gage said, though he already knew. "My name is Victor Kress," the man said, "and the thing Trey Caldwell found out before he died. You need to know what it is." The desert wind moved through the parking lot. Gage looked at the man who had just said Trey's name like he owned it, and the shape of everything Gage thought he understood about the past 18 months. The deaths, the grief, the memorial patches, the broken pieces of the club he'd been trying to hold together with both hands began to rearrange itself into something he didn't recognize. He stepped back from the door. Victor Kress walked in. He was 60-something, lean in the way of a man who'd never been soft, gray at the temples and around the jaw. He wore civilian clothes, dark slacks, a button-down, a jacket that hadn't come from a rack. He moved with the particular economy of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where the furniture was arranged to give one person the advantage and who had long since stopped needing the furniture. He sat in the single chair by the window without being invited, the way men sat who understood that permission was a social construct other people needed. Gage stayed standing. "You said Trey's name like you knew him," Gage said. "I knew of him," Kress said, "the way you know of something that becomes relevant to your work." "What work?" Kress looked at him steadily. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you react. Because your first reaction is going to be wrong, and your second reaction is going to be closer, and the third one is the one that matters." Gage said nothing. He crossed his arms and stood in the middle of the motel room in his jacket with the desert wind pressing against the window and waited. Kress said, "Trey Caldwell didn't die by suicide." The room went very still. Gage heard his own breathing, heard the AC unit, heard the distant interstate miles away, a truck doing what trucks did at 4 a.m. on Route 89. "Say that again," he said. His voice was level. It took effort. "Trey was killed," Kress said. "It was staged. The medical examiner's report was filed by a Dr. Carl Whitmore at Yavapai Regional. Whitmore has been on the payroll of a man named Raymond Stahl for approximately 6 years. The ruling was incorrect, and it was incorrect deliberately." Gage didn't move. "Raymond Stahl," he said. "You know the name." He knew the name. Everyone in the Arizona MC world knew the name, the way you knew the name of weather systems. Not because you wanted to, but because not knowing it was a liability. Raymond Stahl ran money through 3 legitimate businesses in Scottsdale and Phoenix, a logistics company, a commercial property management firm, and a chain of automotive detailing shops that had more garage space than any detailing operation legitimately needed. He wasn't a clubman. He didn't wear leather. He didn't ride. He was the kind of man who hired people to be dangerous so he didn't have to be, and who maintained the specific plausible distance from every bad thing that happened in his orbit that made him very difficult to touch. "What did Trey find?" Gage said. Kress reached into his jacket and produced a phone. He set it on the dresser face up. On the screen was a photograph, a document photographed on a desk, the image clear enough to read if you were standing close. Gage crossed the room and looked at it. It was a financial transfer record. The account numbers were redacted in the photograph, but the amounts weren't. And the amounts, across a 6-column table, added up to something that took Gage 3 seconds to understand, and then kept getting worse the longer he looked. "Marcus Webb," he said. "The truck driver who crossed the center line," Kress said. "Yes. He was paid. His debts were paid. His family's debts. His mother's medical bills, substantial, she had late-stage kidney disease, were cleared through a shell account 2 weeks before the accident. Webb didn't know what he was doing, in all likelihood. He was told a story, possibly that it was an anonymous donor, possibly something else." Kress paused. "He died in the accident, too, which may or may not have been part of the arrangement." Gage stood with his hands on the dresser and looked at the photograph on the phone and felt the floor of the last 18 months shift beneath him. Not collapsing, not yet, but moving in the way of ground that has lost its foundation and hasn't finished settling. "Dobie Raines," he said. A pause. "We're still establishing that." "Dobie had a cardiac event," Gage said. "He was 44. He had no prior documented history," Kress said. "That's not the same thing." The back of Gage's neck had gone cold. Not fear. Something harder and more specific than fear. The physical sensation of understanding arriving faster than he could process it, the body registering before the mind caught up. "Why?" he said. He turned from the dresser. "Why would Stahl want 3 Iron Vultures dead?" Kress looked at him with the expression of a man who'd been waiting for the question and had decided how much of the answer to give. "Trey was the reason we know as much as we know," he said. "He was careful, and he was smart, and approximately 3 weeks before he died, he photographed that document in Raymond Stahl's Scottsdale office." "How did Trey get into Stahl's office?" Kress said. "Because someone inside your club put him there." The silence that came after that sentence was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. This one had a texture. This one pressed. "That's not possible," Gage said. It came out quieter than he intended. "I know that's what you believe. I know every man in my club." "You know who they are now," Kress said. "Not necessarily who they were 6 years ago, or who reached them when they were in a specific kind of trouble, or what was offered and what was owed and how those calculations compound over time." He met Gage's eyes. "I'm not telling you your club is rotten. I'm telling you there is one compromised member, and that person has been feeding information to Stahl's organization for at least 3 years." A knock at the door. Mason's knock this time. 3 even beats. Gage went to the door. Mason was there with Cole behind him, both dressed, both reading his face the moment the door opened. Mason's eyes went immediately to Kress in the chair. Cole's hand moved slightly toward his jacket and then stopped. "Who is he?" Mason said. "A man with information," Gage said. "Come in." They came in. The room was not built for 4 people and a conversation this weight, but it held. Mason took the wall, Cole took the doorway, back to the frame, facing the room. Their positions were instinctive and geometric, and Kress noticed them with the slight acknowledgement of someone who understood what he was looking at. "Tell them what you told me," Gage said. Kress told them. Mason listened without moving. His stillness was the specific stillness of controlled processing, the same stillness he used when the situation required him to receive bad information without reacting to the first layer of it. Cole's face was harder to read. Cole had gone somewhere internal, the way he did when something required him to run it against a framework he kept private. When Kress finished, Mason said, "Who are you?" "I work for an organization that has been building a case against Raymond Stahl for 4 years, Kress said. "Federal adjacent, not FBI, not DEA. The details of the organization aren't relevant to what I need from you." "What you need from us," Mason said. "The photograph Trey took is half of what we need. The other half is the source document, the original. It's in Stahl's Scottsdale office, specifically in a secondary set of physical files that Stahl maintains off-system, because Stahl is old enough to distrust digital storage and paranoid enough to have reasons." Kress looked at Gage. "We've been unable to access those files. We've had 2 attempts in 14 months, both unsuccessful, because someone told Stahl we were coming." "Your leak," Cole said. It was the first thing he'd said. "Our leak," Kress confirmed, "which has since been addressed." A pause that suggested addressed was doing significant work in that sentence. "And now you want us to do what your people couldn't," Mason said. "You have an asset we don't," Kress said. "What asset?" Kress looked at Gage. Raymond Stahl's property management firm handles 3 commercial buildings in Phoenix. One of them is the building where Iron Vulture's Phoenix chapter garage is located. He paused. "Stahl owns your lease." The room absorbed this. Mason looked at Gage. Gage looked at the wall. "We've been his tenants for 3 years, Mason said. Not a question, just the shape of the thing arriving. "You have physical access to the building's secondary service tunnel that connects to the Scottsdale office annex," Kress said. "Access that his security system doesn't flag because it's flagged as Iron Vulture's regular traffic. You've been using that access for years without knowing what it bordered. He set a folded paper on the dresser beside his phone. The layout. Nobody moved toward the paper. Cole said from the doorway, "Who in our club?" Cress looked at him. "You said there's someone compromised," Cole said. "You don't come to us with that and leave it open." "Who?" "I have a name," Cress said. "I'm not going to tell you tonight." "Why?" "Because the way you react to that name is going to determine whether this works or falls apart," Cress said. "And you need the rest of what I've told you to settle before you hear it." Cole looked at him for a long time with the eyes of a man running an assessment that had nothing to do with whether he liked what he was hearing. "That's not how this works," Cole said. "Tonight it is," Cress said. He stood from the chair. He picked up his phone and pocketed it. He left the folded paper on the dresser. "I'll be in touch tomorrow at noon. Between now and then, don't talk to anyone in the club about this. No one. Not until I've given you the name and you've decided what to do with it." He walked to the door. Cole didn't move out of the doorway. The two men looked at each other for a moment. Then Cole stepped aside. Cress walked out into the orange neon parking lot and was in a dark sedan and gone before Mason had crossed to the window to watch him go. The three of them stood in the small motel room with the folded paper on the dresser and the AC running its futile effort and the desert night pressing against the window. Mason said, "Trey?" "Yeah," Gage said. A silence. Then Mason's hand went flat against the wall. Not a slam, just a slow press, a man grounding himself against a surface when the floor wasn't trustworthy. His head dropped for a moment, just a moment, then came back up. 3 years, Mason said. "We've been sitting on land he owns for 3 years." "We didn't know." "Somebody did," Cole said. He said it quietly, which made it worse. Gage looked at the paper on the dresser and didn't touch it. "We don't move until noon," he said. "Not one word to anyone else in the club until we have the name." "You trust him," Cole said. "I don't trust him," Gage said. "I trust what he showed me, and I trust the direction it points." He looked at Mason. "Marcus Webb's debts, his mother's medical bills. He was used, and he probably didn't know it." Mason nodded slowly. "And Dobie? We don't know yet." "We're going to know," Mason said. And there was something in how he said it, not rage, not grief, but the specific cold determination of a man who has decided that the accounting is going to happen and is already working out what it requires. They were quiet for a moment. Cole said, 9 people in this chapter. You, me, Mason, Dex, Ray, Sully, Pete, Crank, and Crank's prospect Hector, who got his patch 4 months ago. He was counting, running it the way Cole ran everything, systematically, without sentiment. One of them fed stall information for 3 years. One of them has been inside every conversation, every decision, every move we made. Gage looked at him. "Every move," Cole said again, letting it sit. The implication arrived without needing to be spoken aloud. Every move included the memorial rides, the routes, the timing, the windows when the club was away from Phoenix, when the garage was unmanned, when Trey had been alone. "Go back to your room," Gage said. "Both of you. Sleep if you can. Don't talk to anyone." Mason looked at him. "And you?" "I'll sleep." He wouldn't sleep. They left. Gage sat on the edge of the bed and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor and ran through the 9 names like a man handling something sharp, carefully, with attention to where the edges were. Dex, whose sister had a system for evacuating her children, whose phone Gage had had in his hand 6 hours ago. Ray, who slept in parking lots and looked at stars and had never, in 8 years, said an unnecessary word. Sully, 3 daughters, bought crackers for a stranger's child without hesitation. Pete, 8 years as a trauma nurse, the form in his eyes when he'd said, "I can go with her." Crank Gerald Warren, who was the most guileless man Gage had ever known in a world that rewarded guile. Hector Garza, 26, 4 months out of his prospect period, who still cleaned the older men's bikes before his own, out of a habit of respect he'd never been asked to explain. He went through all of them, and none of them fit, and all of them fit in the way that every person fit once you applied enough suspicion, and that was the specific poison of what Cress had said. Not the revelation itself, but the doubt it introduced, which would now live in the spaces between every conversation and every silence until it was resolved. He picked up the folded paper. The layout was detailed, hand-drawn, precise, annotated in a small, tight handwriting. The service tunnel, the access points, the specific corridor that connected through the building's eastern wall to the annex structure. He knew this building. He'd been in and out of it 300 times. He'd never looked at the eastern wall. He folded the paper again. He put it in his jacket. He lay back on the bed without taking the jacket off and looked at the ceiling and tried to remember the last 3 years with the new information written into it. Every move, every decision, every moment someone outside the circle had known something they shouldn't, and the picture that assembled itself in the dark of the motel room was something he'd have to look at fully in the morning because right now it was too large and too jagged, and he needed a few hours before he could hold it without cutting himself on it. He closed his eyes. He thought about Trey's laugh. Too big for him, Cole had said, like a man twice his size. He thought about the memorial patch on his sleeve, still stiff, TC and block letters inside the bottom rocker. He thought about a 28-year-old kid who'd been smart enough and careful enough to walk into Raymond Stahl's office and photograph a document and careful enough not to tell anyone what he'd found, which meant he'd known or suspected that telling someone inside the club was a risk he couldn't take. Trey had known. Trey had died alone with the knowledge. And now Gage was lying in a motel room at 5 a.m. with the same knowledge and the same problem. He didn't sleep. At 7:30, his phone lit up, the 602 number again. He answered it this time. Cress said, "Change of timeline. The name needs to happen now." Gage sat up. "Why?" "Because your club is already moving and I can't wait until noon." A pause that had weight in it. "Hector Garza drove away from the Desert Star Inn at 5:45 this morning. I have eyes on the motel. He made a call before he left. 16-second call to a number registered to one of Stahl's businesses. The room was very cold. "Hector," Gage said. "He's been in contact with Stahl's people since before his prospect period ended," Cress said. "We believe he was placed. Not recruited. Placed. Put into your chapter deliberately, with the intention of being patched in. 4 months since his patch. 8 years of chapter history in that time. Access to everything. Access to Trey." "Where is he now?" Gage said. "Driving north on 89, Cress said. "Toward a property Stahl owns outside Chino Valley." Gage was on his feet. "Do not go after him alone," Cress said, the urgency sharp and uncharacteristic for the first time since the man had spoken to him. "Stahl will know you know within the hour. When Stahl knows you know, the calculus changes and everything at the Scottsdale office moves or burns. We have one window. One." A pause. "And your chapter is split. Half in Prescott, the wrong man already gone, and Raymond Stahl about to find out his operation has a problem with your name on it." Gage stood in the center of the motel room with his jacket on and the folded layout in his pocket and the full weight of what Cress was describing falling into place like a structure finally revealing its true load-bearing points. And the understanding that arrived with it was not rage, not grief, but something colder and more operational than either, something that had been trained into him in a series of places that didn't exist on maps and had never entirely left. He had 6 men he trusted completely. He had one window. He had a building he knew better than the man who owned it. And somewhere on Route 89 heading north, a 26-year-old with 4 months of Iron Vulture's leather on his back was driving toward a phone call that would decide whether the next 12 hours left his club intact or burned it to the ground. "Don't lose him," Gage said. "I won't," Cress said. Gage ended the call and crossed to the door and went out into the thin desert morning where the sun was still low and the bikes were still in their row, and the air smelled of cold asphalt and creosote and the particular sharpness of a day that had already decided to be something no one was prepared for. He knocked on Mason's door 3 times, hard. Mason opened the door before Gage finished the 3rd knock. He was dressed. He'd been dressed since 5 a.m., which meant he hadn't slept either, which meant Mason had been running the same calculations in the dark of his own room and had arrived at approximately the same place. He looked at Gage's face and read it the way he'd been reading it for 8 years. "How bad?" Mason said. "Hector," Gage said. A beat that lasted less than a second. Mason's jaw tightened once and then went still. "Tell me on the way," he said, and grabbed his jacket off the chair behind him. Cole was already outside. He was standing by the bikes with his arms crossed, and his breath misting in the cold morning air, watching the road, watching the space where Hector's bike was not. He turned when they came out, and his eyes asked the question, and Gage answered it with a nod, and something moved across Cole's face that wasn't surprise. The expression of a man receiving confirmation of a thing he'd already begun to suspect and had hoped was wrong. 4 months, Cole said. Placed, Gage said, before the prospect period. Deliberate. Cole looked at the empty space where the bike had been. He was at Trey's service, he said. He stood at the grave. Nobody had an answer for that, because there wasn't one that made the arithmetic work in a way anyone could live with easily. They woke the others. Not Dex, who was with his sister, and Pete, who Gage called directly and spoke to in 2 sentences. Stay with Elena. Take her to the clinic. Don't move until I call you. Pete asked one question, how serious? And Gage said serious enough, and Pete said understood, and that was the complete transaction. The remaining 5, Gage, Mason, Cole, Sully, and Ray, were on their bikes and out of the Desert Star Inn parking lot before 7:50. Crank was given the short version in motion, standing beside his bike with the engine not yet running, and the way his face moved through it, the disbelief, the calculation, the landing, was a compressed version of what all of them had done in the dark separately. When Gage finished, Crank stood for a moment and then said, "Hector cleaned my bike every week for 8 months." He said it like a man noting a specific wound. Then he put on his helmet and started his engine. Cress had texted an address, not a phone call, a text, 3 lines. The address outside Chino Valley, a notation that Hector had arrived 40 minutes ago, and a single word at the end, careful. They ran Route 89 north in tight formation, 6 bikes in the cold morning air, the sun still low and red at the edge of the desert, throwing long shadows across the road ahead of them. The temperature was in the mid-50s and falling with the wind speed, and Gage felt it across his hands and at the back of his neck and welcomed it because cold was clarifying in a way that heat wasn't. Cold made things precise. The property outside Chino Valley was visible from the highway as a cluster of structures behind a chain-link fence, a primary building that looked like a converted ranch operation, 2 smaller outbuildings, and what appeared to be a covered equipment bay that was too large for any agricultural purpose Gage could identify. A gravel access road ran off the highway and ended at a gate. The gate was open. Gage signaled. They pulled off the highway a 1/4 mile south and parked off the road, behind a rise of desert scrub that gave them line of sight without giving them away. He killed his engine. The others followed. The sudden silence was large and full of bird sound, ravens somewhere to the east doing what ravens did. He glassed the property with the compact field binoculars he kept in his right saddlebag, a habit from a different life that had outlasted that life's other habits. Through the lenses, Hector's bike parked outside the primary building. A dark SUV, Arizona plates, parked alongside it. A second vehicle, older truck, near the equipment bay. No visible personnel outside. He passed the binoculars to Mason. Mason looked for 15 seconds. 2 on the roof of the main building, he said. Left side, back corner, standing. Gage hadn't caught them. How many inside, you think? SUV holds 6 comfortably, Mason said. Truck holds 3. If there's security, they're not all on the roof. Cole said, "We're not going in there." "No," Gage said. "Then what?" "We're waiting," Gage said. Cress said 1 window. "The window isn't here." He looked at the property and then at the highway behind them. "The window is in Scottsdale. Whatever Hector told them this morning, whatever call he made, Stahl's people are now deciding whether to move the files or whether they think they have time. That decision is being made right now." Mason lowered the binoculars. "You want to let Hector walk." It wasn't what Gage wanted. What Gage wanted was a thing he wasn't going to describe in detail because the description was not useful and the wanting was not actionable at 8 a.m. on the side of Route 89. "I want the files," he said. "I want what Trey died for. Everything else comes after." The silence in the group had a specific texture, not disagreement, but the weight of men processing a hierarchy of objectives that required them to set aside an immediate, visceral need in favor of a strategic one. It was a discipline they'd all learned somewhere, in different schools, at different costs. Crank said, "And if Stahl moves the files before we get there?" "Then Kress loses his case," Gage said, "and Raymond Stahl keeps operating, and the next time someone stumbles onto something they shouldn't know, we bury another patch." Nobody said anything else about waiting. Gage sent Kress a text. "Chino Valley property confirmed. We're holding. How long before Scottsdale moves?" Kress responded in 4 minutes. "Our contact says assets being reviewed this morning. 30 to 60-minute window before they decide. You need to move now." He showed Mason the screen. Mason said, "Scottsdale is 90 minutes from here. 80 if we push it." "We push it," Cole said. They mounted up. The run south was the fastest sustained highway ride Gage had made in years. Not reckless, because reckless on a 2-lane with cross-traffic was how you ended up as a mark on somebody else's memorial patch, but committed, the throttle held at the edge of what the road allowed. The formation tight and synchronized, 6 men running in a unit with the shared focus of people who understood what was at the other end of the ride. Gage's mind ran the building layout the entire way down. He'd had it memorized by 6 a.m. The service tunnel, the access points, the eastern corridor. He'd been in that building more times than he could count, and none of those times had he known what was 17 feet past the eastern wall. The specific ignorance of that sat badly. Not because he should have known, there was no reason to have known, but because it was the clearest evidence of how thoroughly the situation had been constructed around them without their awareness. 3 years of lease payments going to Raymond Stahl. 3 years of the club's physical presence in a building that Stahl had chosen for them. The mechanic in him appreciated the architecture of it, even while the rest of him wanted to put it through a wall. They hit the Phoenix Metro at 9:20 and the Scottsdale address at 9:44. The building was in an industrial commercial corridor east of the city center, 4 stories, mid-century construction updated at the exterior with a veneer of corporate anonymity. Iron Vulture's garage occupied the eastern ground floor unit. They'd been here 1,000 times. The parking was internal, the garage doors rolling up on a code they'd never had reason to question. Gage punched the code. The door rolled up. He rode his bike inside, and the others followed, and the door came back down behind them, and the familiar smell of the garage hit him. Oil, rubber, cold metal, the particular chemistry of a working shop. And for a moment, the familiarity of it was almost worse than anything else, because this space had been home, and now it had a different set of meanings overlaid on the original ones. They dismounted. The garage was empty. No prospect, no visiting members, no one. Which was either coincidence or not, and Gage was no longer in the business of calling things coincidence. Mason went straight to the eastern wall. He ran his hand along the drywall seam near the floor, then moved to the shelving unit. 8 feet of metal shelving bolted to the wall and loaded with parts inventory. He looked at Gage. The layout had shown the tunnel access behind the shelving. A door, standard commercial construction, that would read as a utility closet from this side. They moved the shelving in 4 minutes. Not quietly, but the building's industrial construction absorbed the sound. Behind it, a door. Gray steel, no handle on the garage side, a keypad mounted at shoulder height. Gage looked at the keypad, looked at Kress's layout, which showed the access code in the same tight handwriting as everything else. He entered it. The door clicked. He pushed it open. The tunnel was narrow and utilitarian. Concrete floor, cinder block walls, fluorescent lighting on a motion sensor that flickered on as they entered. It smelled of concrete dust and something faintly chemical, like cleaning product used in enclosed spaces. It ran straight for approximately 60 feet and then turned right, and the layout said the turn led to a stairwell that opened into the annex building's 2nd floor. Gage went first, Mason second, Cole behind him. Sully and Ray stayed in the garage. Gage's call, and nobody argued. If this went wrong, someone needed to be able to move and make noise and draw attention in the other direction. Sully understood the assignment. He'd done it before in a different context, for the Army on a mountainside, and the principle was the same. You hold the door. Frank went last into the tunnel, pulling the hidden door to without latching it. The walk took 90 seconds. The stairwell door at the end opened onto a second-floor corridor that was cleaner and quieter than the tunnel. Commercial carpeting, recessed lighting, the particular hush of a building where people worked with paper and kept their voices down. 3 doors on the left side, 2 on the right, 1 at the end. Cress's layout. End of the corridor, left door. The corridor was empty. Gage moved. He was 10 feet from the end door when it opened. The man who came out was not a security guard. He was 60, soft at the middle, in a business shirt with the sleeves rolled, carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone reviewing a problem. He looked up from the folder and saw 4 men in Iron Vulture's leather standing in his corridor, and the folder went sideways out of his hand and he took a step back. Gage said, "We're not here for you. Go back in that room and stay there." The man looked at him. His mouth was open. "Now," Mason said from behind Gage. The man went back in the room. The door clicked shut. Gage kept moving. The end door was unlocked. Cress had said it would be, said Stahl considered the building's main security sufficient and the internal doors secondary, which was a failure of imagination that was about to be expensive. He pushed it open. The office was spare and organized in the way of a person who preferred to keep evidence of their operations contained. A desk, 2 chairs, a lateral filing cabinet along the left wall, a window overlooking the parking structure with the blinds half drawn. No computer on the desk, just a leather writing pad and a telephone that was probably not connected to anything digital. And behind the desk, because nothing was going to be cleaned today and nothing had been cleaned since 4 a.m., and possibly for 3 years before that, Raymond Stahl. He was 67 and looked like the money he had. Silver-haired, well-cut jacket, the particular physical ease of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where other people were nervous. He had a coffee cup on the desk to his right and a phone in his hand to his left, and when the door opened, he looked up and his face ran through a sequence in about 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, something that might in another man have been fear, but in Stahl manifested as a very rapid reassessment of options. He set the phone down, slowly. The specific slowness of a man who understood that fast moves in this geometry were not in his interest. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Gage stopped. Stahl knew his name. Of course he did. "Sit down," Gage said. Stahl looked at the 4 men in his doorway with the assessment of someone who'd dealt with dangerous men before, who'd hired them and used them and occasionally had them removed, and who was now calculating whether the set of dangerous men in front of him fell into a category he'd encountered or a new one. He arrived at an answer Gage could read on his face. New category. He sat. "The files," Gage said. Stahl said nothing. "The physical files," Gage said. "The secondary set, the transfer records." Stahl looked at him steadily. "I don't know what you're—" "Trey Caldwell photographed them," Gage said. "In this office, 3 weeks before he died." The name landed. Stahl's face didn't change, exactly. He was too controlled for that. But something shifted behind the control, the way something shifted in deep water when a heavy object moved along the bottom. "I'm going to tell you how this goes," Gage said. He pulled a chair from the wall and set it in front of the desk, and sat in it, because standing over a man for this conversation was the wrong geometry. He wanted eye level. He wanted Stahl to understand that this was not intimidation. It was conclusion. "You're going to give me those files, and then you're going to sit in this room until a man named Victor Cress sends whoever he sends to pick you up. And that's the entire shape of your morning." Stahl looked at him. "And if I don't," he said, "then I'm going to spend the next several hours in this office going through everything in that cabinet," Gage said. "And what I find I'm going to photograph, and what I photograph goes to Cress and to a journalist at the Arizona Republic whose contact information I happen to have. And we do this the longer way." He paused. "Your call." A silence. The kind of silence Stahl probably used in rooms like this to apply pressure, to let other people's nerves fill the space and betray them. He was doing it now. It was a good technique. Gage had sat in enough interrogation rooms on both sides of the table to be comfortable in it. Cole from the doorway said, "We buried a 28-year-old kid last week." He said it without inflection, without heat, which was the most effective way to say it because it didn't give Stahl anything to push back against. It was just a fact. floating in the room, claiming its space. Stahl looked at Cole. Something moved in Stahl's face. Not remorse. Gage wasn't naive enough to assign remorse to a man who'd gotten to 67 by not having too much of it. But recognition. The specific recognition of a man who understood that the accounting was here, and that the men in front of him were not the type to be managed or redirected or bought, and that the calculation had shifted beyond the point where his usual tools applied. He opened the desk drawer. Mason moved. "Paper," Stahl said, keeping his voice even. "Just paper." He produced a key from the drawer, set it on the desk. "Bottom drawer of the cabinet," he said, "the lock on the left side." Mason went to the cabinet. Gage kept his eyes on Stahl. The drawer opened. Mason lifted a bound folder. Thick, banded, the kind of physical record that someone had maintained with the care of someone who didn't trust anything they couldn't hold. He opened it, scanned 3 pages, and looked at Gage. "This is it," Mason said. Gage nodded. He looked at Stahl. Stahl looked back at him across the desk with the expression of a man who has just watched something slip through his hands that he'd held for a long time. "Marcus Webb's mother," Gage said. "Does she know where the money came from?" Stahl said nothing. "She deserves to know what her son was used for," Gage said. "That's going to happen whether you tell me or not. But it'll come out gentler if you tell me now." A pause. "She was told it was an insurance settlement," Stahl said. "From a class action. She has no knowledge of any other source." "Keep it that way," Gage said. "Whatever you tell Kress when he gets here, keep her out of it." Stahl looked at him. "Why do you care about that?" "Because she lost her son," Gage said. "And that's already enough." He stood up. Crank stepped forward and handed Stahl a zip tie, the way you handed someone something they were going to need to use themselves. Stahl looked at it. Then, with the specific resignation of a man who understood the full scope of what had arrived in his office, he secured his own wrist to the arm of his chair. Gage texted Kress. "We have it. Office secured. Subject in place. Send your people." The response came back in under a minute. En route. 12 minutes. Hold position. 12 minutes in Raymond Stahl's office with Mason holding the folder and Cole at the door and the desert morning outside the half-drawn blinds beginning to heat toward the day it was going to become. Gage stood at the window and looked at the parking structure and thought about Trey. About Marcus Webb's mother, who didn't know the truth and probably never would and might be better off not knowing, and about whether that was mercy or complicity, and whether the line between those things was as clear as he'd always needed to believe. His phone buzzed. "Dex, Elena's at the clinic. Pete's with her. She's filing." He texted back, "Good." Another buzz. "Kayla. Are you okay?" Mason texted me. He stared at the message for a moment. He texted back, "I'm okay. Call you after noon, I promise." She sent back a single response. 3 letters, lowercase, the abbreviated vocabulary of her generation that he was still learning to read. "Okay." He put the phone in his pocket. Behind him, Stahl was very still in his chair. Mason was at the wall with the folder. Cole's breathing was the steady breathing of a man who'd found the rhythm of a long, difficult thing and intended to hold it. The 12 minutes passed. Kress came in with 2 people Gage didn't recognize, younger, efficient, the unmarked confidence of federal-adjacent work. And they took the folder, and they photographed the office, and they spoke to Stahl in the specific register of people who've had this conversation before and know exactly how it ends. On the way out, Kress stopped beside Gage in the corridor. "You'll have subpoenas in the next 48 hours, he said. "All of you. Standard." "I know," Gage said. "The Whitmore situation, the ME, is going to take longer. The ruling on Caldwell will be formally reopened. It's not fast." "I know," Gage said again. Kress looked at him for a moment. "You did it right," he said. "Coming in here the way you did instead of—" He stopped. "Instead of what?" Gage said. Kress didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Both men understood the alternate version of the morning, the one that would have felt more immediate and cost everything after. "Trey deserves better than the alternate version," Gage said. Kress nodded. "Yes," he said. "He does." He walked away down the corridor, his 2 people ahead of him, the folder in the hand of the one on the left, and Gage watched them go and then turned back to find Mason and Cole already moving toward the stairwell, already heading back through the tunnel, already in the process of returning to the garage and the bikes in the cold Scottsdale morning. He followed. In the garage, Sully was sitting on his bike with the engine off, and Ray was standing at the garage door with his arms crossed, both of them having maintained exactly the position they'd been asked to maintain, and the specific relief Gage felt at seeing them where he'd left them was the relief of a man who'd spent the last 4 hours unable to fully trust any arrangement and had just found one that held. "We good?" Sully said. "We're good," Gage said. "Stahl?" "In his office." "Hector?" Cole said from behind Gage, asking the question the group had been not asking for the last 2 hours. Gage looked at them. 6 men in a garage that now had a different meaning than it had had 24 hours ago. 6 men who had spent the morning finding out that the shape of the last 3 years was not the shape they'd thought it was, and who were now standing in the aftermath of that with the dust still settling. "Hector is on Cress's list," he said. "It's federal from here." "That's not an answer," Cole said. "It's the only answer that doesn't cost us everything we just did," Gage said. "You want Stahl to walk because we went after his asset before the case was filed? You want Trey's ruling to stay what it is because we couldn't hold for 12 more hours?" Cole looked at him. Gage looked back. The silence between them was the silence of 2 men who agreed on the outcome and disagreed on the cost of it, and who'd had this argument before in different forms, and who both understood that the road captain's job was sometimes to be the person who held the line that everyone else needed held. "No," Cole said finally. "I don't want that." "All right," Gage said. He opened the garage door. The Scottsdale morning came in, warm already, the desert doing its thermal math, the sky a flat bright blue, with no clouds and no apology. The bikes were where they'd been left. His Road King, black tank, the bird mid-dive in gunmetal and red, chrome dulled from yesterday's desert run. He stood in the doorway and looked at it and thought about a 7-year-old girl with braids and a gap in her teeth who had walked across a parking lot toward danger she didn't recognize as danger, and handed the most broken man in her immediate vicinity the last cookie in the box. He thought about what she'd said. "Then you should call your daughter." He thought about Mason's text to Kayla, which he hadn't asked for and which had arrived anyway, the way Mason's presence always arrived, without asking, exactly when it was needed. He thought about Cole in the dirt, about Elena's pre-packed bag, about the form letter, about Dex carrying 8 months alone, about the shape of all the things people carried when the systems that were supposed to hold weight failed to hold it. He reached into his jacket and took out his phone. He called Kayla. It rang once. She answered, "Dad, are you actually okay?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm actually okay." A pause. Then, "What happened?" And for the first time in longer than he could accurately account for, instead of shortening it into the version that required less of both of them, he said, "It's a long story. You got time?" A beat, small. "I've got practice," she said, but I've got 10 minutes first." 10 minutes, he said. "Okay." He walked out of the garage into the Scottsdale morning, and he talked to his daughter, really talked, in the way she'd been asking him to talk since she was old enough to know the difference. And behind him the club moved in the quiet choreography of men who understood when to be present and when to give a man the space to do the thing he needed to do, and the sun kept climbing, and the desert kept doing what the desert did. And somewhere on Route 89 heading back toward Prescott, the day was already becoming something none of them had planned for when they'd left Flagstaff yesterday morning on a memorial ride for a 28-year-old kid with a laugh too big for his body and the specific, quiet courage of a man who'd found out the truth and decided it was worth the cost of knowing it. The call lasted 14 minutes instead of 10, because some things don't fit the time you have and require the time they need. And when it ended, Gage stood in the parking lot with his phone in his hand and the iron vultures assembled around their bikes, waiting, and Mason looked at him from across the row of chrome and leather with an expression that asked no questions and required no answers, and Gage nodded once and Mason nodded back. "Mount up," Gage said. Engines started, one after another, the deep percussive roll of 6 Harleys coming alive in sequence, the sound moving through the parking structure and out into the street and up into the flat blue Arizona sky. They had one more thing to do before the day was finished. One more stop on the road that had started yesterday at a forgotten gas station with a girl in a yellow dress and a box of broken cookies, and which had bent through everything it had bent through to arrive here, at this moment, with these men, in this light. Gage put on his helmet. He pulled out of the garage and turned north. The others followed. And somewhere ahead on the road, the last thing this day required of them was waiting, not with threats, not with danger, but with the specific quiet weight of something that needed to be said to someone who had started all of this without knowing she'd started anything at all, and who deserved to know that the man she'd handed a broken cookie to in the Arizona desert had not wasted what she'd given him. The bikes disappeared into the Scottsdale morning, 6 dark shapes moving north in tight formation, chrome catching the high sun, engines running true. Behind them, in a second-floor office on the east side of the city, Raymond Stahl sat in his chair and waited for the accounting that had, after 3 years and 3 lives and 1 small box of homemade cookies, finally arrived at his door. And in a clinic in downtown Prescott, a woman named Elena signed her name to a document that her brother stood beside her to witness, and the pen in her hand moved with the specific steadiness of someone who had decided that surviving it was no longer sufficient and that handling it began today. The road ran north. The day was not done. But the worst of it, the hidden worst of it, the 3-year worst of it, was finally, irrevocably, in the light. They found Naomi Quinn's car in the driveway of a small house on Copper Basin Road in Prescott, a pale green house with a covered porch and a ceramic pot of petunias by the front step that someone had been watering with the determined optimism of a person who intended to keep things alive regardless of the circumstances. 6 bikes in formation, pulling to the curb. Gage killed his engine. The street was quiet in the late morning way of residential neighborhoods. A dog somewhere. A sprinkler system ticking through its cycle 2 houses down. The specific hush of a weekday in a place where most people had gone where they needed to go and wouldn't be back until afternoon. The desert heat was building toward its daily peak, but hadn't arrived yet, and the air still held something of the morning in it, the thin coolness that the high desert rationed out before it took it back. He sat on his bike for a moment. Mason pulled up beside him and cut his engine, Cole behind him, the others in sequence. 6 engines going quiet in a residential street, the sound contracting to birdsong and sprinkler and the distant bark of the dog. Gage didn't know what he was going to say. He'd spent the 90-minute ride from Scottsdale running through versions of it and rejecting them one by one, because every version that started with an explanation sounded wrong, and every version that started with an apology sounded worse. He wasn't apologizing for anything he'd done. He was arriving because something had started here, in the desert, at a gas station with a child's box of cookies, and it had bent through everything it had bent through, and it needed to close in a way that a phone call couldn't close. He dismounted. He walked up the path to the pale green house. He knocked. Footsteps. A pause. The pause of someone looking through a window or a peephole, assessing, and he was aware of how he looked from the inside of that door. A man in iron vulture's leather, with 5 more behind him in the street, which was not a presentation optimized for casual afternoon visits. He thought about ringing the bell instead. He thought about leaving. He thought about the cookie, soft at the center. He waited. The door opened. Naomi Quinn looked at him with an expression that moved from alarm through recognition to something more complicated in the span of about 2 seconds. She was wearing a different blouse than yesterday, and her hair was down, and she looked like someone who'd had approximately as much sleep as he had, which was not much, but she was upright and present, and her eyes were clear. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Gage," he said. "I'm sorry to just... We were in the area, and I wanted to make sure you arrived okay. And He stopped. "I wanted to tell you something. About yesterday." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him at the street, at the row of bikes and the 5 men sitting on them with a studied patience that was its own kind of courtesy. "Come in," she said. He shook his head. "Just a minute on the porch. I don't want to." "Come in," she said again. "All of you." He turned and looked at Mason. Mason looked back at him with the expression of a man who was leaving the call to the road captain and also clearly thought the road captain should say yes. They came in. The house belonged to Naomi's mother, Margaret, who was 71 and had the specific presence of a woman who had spent decades being formidable and had recently been asked to be vulnerable by her own body and had not entirely forgiven it for the request. She was in a chair in the living room with a throw blanket over her legs and a book face down on the side table. And when 6 bikers walked into her living room, she looked at them with the assessment of someone who'd seen enough of the world to know that the category dangerous men was less fixed than most people treated it. "Margaret," Naomi said, "these are the men from the gas station, the ones Ember gave the cookies to." Margaret looked at them. Then she said, "Sit down. I'll have Naomi make coffee." It was not a suggestion. They sat. The living room was not built for 8 people plus the woman in the chair, but they made it work. Mason and Cole on the couch, Sully and Ray in the 2 dining chairs that Naomi brought through, Crank on the wide arm of a second armchair with the careful balance of a large man in furniture designed for smaller people. Gage stayed standing for a moment and then sat on the floor near the door with his back against the wall, which was where he always ended up when seating was insufficient and it was his job to give up a chair. Ember appeared from the hallway. She was wearing different clothes than yesterday. A blue shirt with a cartoon octopus on it and shorts and the same glittery sneakers, which he suspected were her preferred footwear regardless of occasion. She looked at him and then at the assembled club with the expression of someone confirming a thing she'd already suspected. "You came," she said. "We were in the area," Gage said. She looked at him with the direct assessment of a child who had not yet learned to accept convenient explanations. "That's not why," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." She sat down on the floor next to him, which placed her in approximately the position that Gage's daughter Kayla had occupied in the photographs that lived in his phone, at approximately the age Kayla had been when things had gone the way they'd gone, and the specific weight of that parallel arrived without warning and took a moment to absorb. Naomi came from the kitchen with coffee. A tray, mugs, the efficient production of a woman who'd grown up in a house where hospitality was not optional, and a guest without a cup in their hand was a problem to be solved. She moved through the room, distributing mugs with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and when she got to Gage, she crouched down and handed him his and her eyes. When she did it, were the eyes of a woman who'd been awake at 3 a.m. doing her own version of the accounting. "How's your mother?" he said. "Stable," she said. The doctor is cautiously optimistic, which apparently means don't ask more questions and be grateful for the word stable. She sat down on the floor on Ember's other side. 3 people sitting on the floor of Margaret's living room with their backs against the wall and 5 bikers arranged in the furniture above them. Margaret said from her chair to the room in general, "My daughter tells me you're on a memorial ride." "Yes, ma'am," Mason said, "for a young man." 28, Mason said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That's too young," she said, with the simple authority of someone who'd lived long enough to have an accurate sense of what age was appropriate for what kind of loss. "Yes," Mason said. "It is." Gage looked at his coffee. It was real coffee. Not gas station, not vending machine. Something that had been made with attention, the kind of coffee that tasted like someone had decided that doing it well was worth the time it cost. He thought about how to say what he'd come to say, and then he stopped trying to engineer the approach and just said it. "Your daughter did something yesterday that mattered," he said to Naomi. "And I know how it sounds, but I want you to understand that I mean it specifically." He looked down at Ember, who was listening with the full attention of a person who understood that something serious was being said about her and was evaluating it for accuracy. She walked across a parking lot toward 8 men that every other person in that parking lot was afraid of, and she gave us something she'd made herself, and she talked to us like we were just people. He paused. "I have not been just a person to a stranger in longer than I can tell you." Naomi was watching him. "I called my daughter last night," he said. "For the first time in a long time in a way that was actually real, and I'm going to go home and figure out how to do it more, and that started here. With your kid. With a box of cookies." He looked at his mug. "I don't know how to say thank you for that in a way that matches what it was, so I'm just saying it plainly." The room was quiet. Ember looked up at him with her gap-toothed assessment. "Did she answer?" she said. "She answered," he said. Ember nodded, the nod of someone whose recommendation has been validated by subsequent events. Margaret, from her chair, said, "The broken ones taste the same." Everyone looked at her. "She told me last night," Margaret said, "about giving you the broken cookie." The old woman's mouth moved in the particular way of someone containing something that wanted to be larger than the expression she was giving it. "She said you didn't make a face about it, that you just ate it." "It was a good cookie," Gage said. "She burned the bottoms," Margaret said. "I didn't notice," he said. Margaret looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a woman who'd been reading people for 71 years and had gotten very accurate at it. Then she said, "More coffee?" Not as a question, and Naomi went to the kitchen. They stayed for 40 minutes. It was not planned to be 40 minutes. It had been planned to be a brief stop, a handoff of something that needed to be said, a closing of a loop. But the room had its own momentum, and nobody was pulling against it. Ray, who hadn't said more than 12 words across the entirety of the previous day, ended up in a quiet conversation with Margaret about a garden she was trying to maintain despite the limitations her health had imposed, and the seriousness with which Ray engaged with the problem of her watering schedule was the seriousness he brought to everything, which was the seriousness of a man who understood that small things being tended well was not separate from large things being tended well, but was in fact the same practice. Sully produced, from somewhere in his jacket, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be his eldest daughter's drawing of their dog, which he'd been carrying because his daughter had given it to him the morning they'd left and told him to share it if he met anyone who needed to see something good. He gave it to Ember. She studied it with the gravity the work deserved and then asked several technical questions about the dog's breed and temperament that Sully answered with the exhaustive detail of a proud father. Crank sat in the armchair and drank 2 mugs of coffee and said very little, which for Crank was an act of considerable discipline and which the room understood as its own form of respect. Mason sat on the couch and looked at his phone once, and then put it away and didn't look at it again. Cole sat beside Mason and looked at his hands, the same hands that had held a cigarette behind a gas station 24 hours ago, and at some point Naomi came and sat in the chair beside the couch and said something to him that Gage couldn't hear, and Cole said something back, and whatever it was brief and it was enough, because afterward Cole's shoulders had the quality they had after he'd said something that needed saying. Before they left, Naomi walked Gage to the door. They stood on the porch for a moment in the late morning heat. The sprinkler system had finished its cycle. The dog had stopped barking. The street was the street. "Are you going to be all right?" he said. "You and your mom, and Ember." Naomi looked at the ceramic pot of petunias. She touched one of the flowers with a single fingertip, the reflexive touch of a person checking on something living. "I think so," she said. "My mother she's harder than she looks. We all are." She looked at him. "Are you? Going to be all right?" "I think so," he said. "I'm a work in progress." "Aren't we all?" she said, and it was not the platitude it could have been, because she said it with the tired accuracy of someone who'd earned the observation rather than borrowed it. Ember appeared in the doorway behind her mother. "Will you come back?" she said, to Gage specifically, with the direct expectation of a child who still believed that the answer to a reasonable question was usually yes. He crouched down. His knees did what his knees did. He looked at her and the gap between her teeth and the cartoon octopus and the glittery shoes. "If you ever need us to," he said, "you call, okay? Your mom has Mason's number." She considered this. "That's not the same as coming back." "No," he said. "It's not." He looked at her steadily. "But it means you're not alone. That's the part that matters." She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to everything, and then she threw her arms around his neck quickly, the brief, fierce hug of a child who means it completely and doesn't require it to be longer than it needs to be. He put one hand on her back, the burned arm, the one she'd touched yesterday without flinching. Then she let go and went back inside. He stood up. Naomi was watching him with an expression he didn't try to read because it was private and it was hers. "Thank you," he said. for the coffee, and for letting us in." "Thank you," she said, "for coming." He walked down the porch steps and down the path, and the club was already on their bikes, engines not yet running, waiting in the warm late morning with the patience of men who knew how to wait and when to be done waiting. He mounted up. He put on his helmet. He looked back at the pale green house one time, at the porch, at the ceramic pot, at the door already closed, at whatever was continuing behind it that he wasn't part of and didn't need to be part of. And then he put his hands on the bars and nodded and started the engine. 6 engines, the sound rising in the residential street, rolling through it, too big for the space and exactly the right size for the road that followed it. They rode. The afternoon route took them south and then east, the highway opening out the way highways did when the city thinned and the desert resumed its authority. The sun was full overhead now, no angle to it, everything bleached and clear and certain. Gage rode point and the others ran behind him in formation, and the road did what roads did, which was receive them without judgment and offer itself ahead in an unbroken line toward whatever came next. An hour south of Prescott, Gage's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He let it go to voicemail, checked it at the next stop, a pull-off near a canyon overlook, where the view went out for 50 miles, and the wind came up from below with a force that required you to lean into it. The voicemail was from a woman at the Maricopa County Legal Services office. She was calling on behalf of Elena Navarro Briggs, who had filed for a protective order that morning and whose application had been expedited. She wanted to confirm contact information for a reference. Pete Withers' name was on the application as a supporting advocate, and she needed to confirm. Gage called Pete. Pete answered on the second ring. "She did it," he said. Without preamble, without drama. Just the fact, stated with the particular quality of someone who'd been present for something difficult and was reporting the outcome that it had earned. "I know," Gage said. "I got the call." "She was shaking the whole time," Pete said. "Sat in that waiting room for 90 minutes and shook, and then when they called her name, she walked in there and answered every question straight." He paused. "Dex cried in the parking lot after. He'll deny it." "I know he will," Gage said. Another pause. "How'd the other thing go?" "It went," Gage said. "Kress has what he needs. The rest is above our pay grade." "Trey," Pete said. "It's moving," Gage said. "It's going to move slowly, and it's going to be federal, and it's going to be documented, and it's going to be right. That's the most I can promise." To be right. That's the most I can promise right now. A long pause. The wind at the overlook took another run at him, and he leaned into it, and the canyon below went on forever. "That's enough," Pete said. "That's more than we had yesterday." "Yeah," Gage said. "It is." He told Pete to bring Dex back to Phoenix when Elena was settled, and Pete said they'd be back by nightfall, and they hung up, and Gage stood at the overlook for another minute with the canyon below him and the wind making its argument and the 50 miles of desert running out to a horizon that was hard and clean and completely indifferent to the fact that everything had changed in the last 18 hours. He'd been in this landscape his whole adult life. He'd ridden through it in grief and in purpose and in the numb automatic motion of a man putting miles between himself and things he couldn't resolve. He'd always thought the desert's indifference was its defining quality, its refusal to care, to soften, to tell you anything was going to be okay. Standing there now, he thought maybe he'd been reading it wrong. Maybe the indifference wasn't coldness. Maybe it was just honesty. The desert didn't tell you things were going to be okay because it didn't know if they were. It showed you the road and let you decide. He got back on his bike. They stopped for food 60 miles south at a diner called May's on the outskirts of a town whose water tower had the name painted on it in letters that had been repainted many times and were still slightly wrong in their spacing. May's had 7 tables, a counter with 8 stools, a pie display case, and a smell of coffee and griddled butter that had been accumulating since approximately 1987 and was now structural. They took the back 2 tables and a booth. The woman who came to take their orders was in her mid-50s and had the look of someone who'd been working this counter since before the letters on the water tower were repainted the first time, and who was not going to be impressed by leather or chrome or club patches, but who was going to give them excellent service and accurate coffee refills because that was the standard she held herself to regardless of clientele. Her name tag said June. June brought coffee without being asked, which was the sign of a woman who understood her environment and set a basket of rolls on the table between Gage and Mason that nobody had ordered and which vanished in approximately 4 minutes. They ate. Not quickly. Not with the compression of men trying to get somewhere else. With the specific slowness of men who had arrived somewhere they'd been trying to get to and were willing to sit in it for a while. Mason ordered eggs and ate them slowly and didn't look at his phone. Cole ordered pancakes. He ate half, and then pushed the plate aside and sat with his coffee and looked at the window and the road beyond it, and the expression on his face was not peaceful. Cole didn't do peaceful, and Gage suspected he never would, which was all right, because peace wasn't the only way to be okay. But it was settled. The specific settledness of a man who'd said something true the night before and had found afterward that the cost of saying it was less than the cost of not saying it had been. Ray ate a full breakfast with the methodical appreciation of a man who treated each meal as its own complete event. And when June came with the coffee pot, he said, "Thank you, ma'am," with the genuine courtesy of someone who meant it every single time. Crank ate 2 full orders of everything. June looked at the empty plates when she came to clear them and appeared satisfied in the professional way of a cook whose food has been respected. Sully found a charger behind the counter and asked June if he could plug in his phone, and June said sure, and he texted his daughters 3 separate good morning messages and got back 3 separate responses within 5 minutes, which he read with the expression of a man reassembling himself piece by piece after a day that had taken him apart. Gage sat with his coffee and didn't try to make it into anything more than coffee. He thought about Trey's memorial patch, still stiff on his arm. He'd have it the rest of his life, and the stiffness would give eventually, the way all leather gave, softening with wear and time, into something that fit the body it had been carried on. The stiffness wasn't wrong, it was just new. It was the specific texture of a thing that hadn't finished becoming what it was going to be. He thought about Kayla. Afternoon. He'd call her again afternoon, and the conversation they'd started on the phone outside Raymond Stahl's garage would continue into the next conversation, and then the next. And it wouldn't be clean, and it wouldn't be linear, and there would be calls she didn't answer, and things he still wouldn't know how to say. And the road back toward what had been damaged was not going to be a road he could ride at highway speed. But it was a road. It existed. He'd been shown that it existed by a 7-year-old who had looked at him and asked the most honest question anyone had asked him in years. He looked around the table. 8 men, minus 2 who were still in Prescott. 6 men in a diner called Maze on the outskirts of a town in the Arizona desert, with coffee going cold and the road outside running in both directions toward everything they'd have to go back to. The garage with its eastern wall and its changed meaning, the subpoenas that Kress had promised, the long and imperfect work of a formal investigation into 3 deaths that had been mislabeled and misplaced and would now have to be recovered from the bureaucratic wrong shape they'd been folded into. Hector Garza, somewhere on the road with Kress's people behind him, and the question of what you did with the fact that a man you'd patched in had been something other than what you'd believed. Not resolved by Stahl's arrest, not resolved by the federal case, not resolved by anything quick or clean, but requiring the longer and more difficult work of examining how a thing like that happened, what it had cost, and how you rebuilt the specific trust that it had damaged. All of that was real, and all of it was coming, and none of it was going to be easy. But it was going to be real. That was the word. Not clean, not simple, not victorious in the way victory looked in the movies, where the score swelled and the enemy went down, and the light was golden, and everyone knew what it meant. Real, which meant imperfect, and costly, and ongoing, and worth it, and very much not over. Gage put his mug down. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the folded layout Kress had given him, the hand-drawn diagram of the building and its tunnel and its eastern wall. He looked at it for a moment. The tight handwriting, the annotated access points, the evidence of how much someone had planned in advance, and how little of that planning had been aimed at anything he'd have recognized as his own interest. He refolded it. He put it back. Someday it would be evidence. Right now it was just paper, and he was just a man in a diner with coffee going cold and his club around him and the road waiting outside. June came with the check and set it on the table without comment. Crank picked it up before anyone else reached for it, looked at it, and set some bills on the table that were significantly more than the total without any explanation or eye contact. June picked it up. She looked at Crank. Crank looked at his coffee. "Good people," June said, to no one specifically, and went back to the counter. They sat for another few minutes. Nobody rushed it. Then Mason said, "Trey would have hated that diner." Everyone looked at him. "He hated diners," Mason said. "He was a taqueria guy. He drove 40 minutes out of his way in Phoenix for a specific taqueria on 43rd. I went with him twice. He ate 4 tacos each time and talked about them for 3 days after. He was looking at the table, at the space where his plate had been. He had very strong opinions about food." Hoti Crank said, "He once told me that gas station hot dogs were an offense against the concept of dignity." "He wasn't wrong," Ray said. "He was absolutely not wrong," Mason agreed. Cole said nothing, but he smiled, small and private and real, and looked out the window, and that was its own kind of testimony. Gage looked at them, at the specific, particular, irreplaceable faces of the men who'd started this ride with him 2 days ago to honor a kid with a too big laugh and had come through the far side of everything it had become. And he thought, this is the thing. Not the leather, not the bikes, not the club structure or the bylaws or the way they moved in formation. This was the thing, right here, in a diner called Maze with cold coffee and a borrowed phone charger and a patch on each of their sleeves that said someone had been here and mattered and was not going to be forgotten. He stood up. "Okay," he said. Just that. They filed out into the afternoon sun, mounted up, helmets on. The familiar sequence of it, the ritual of departure, each part of it so ingrained it happened below conscious thought. Gage started his engine. He pulled out of May's parking lot and turned south toward Phoenix. The road went straight, and the desert held it on both sides, and the sun was starting its long afternoon decline toward the western ridge, still hours away but beginning the direction that would take it there. His shadow ran ahead of him on the asphalt, long and dark, and he watched it for a moment. This shadow version of himself, riding point the way he always rode point, out in front of everything, running ahead of the weight of it. Then the road bent, and the shadow moved, and he stopped watching it, and just rode. 6 bikes, 1 formation. The sound of them on the empty highway rising and holding and carrying forward. Somewhere behind them, a pale green house on Copper Basin Road. A woman refilling a ceramic pot of petunias. An old woman with a book and a throw blanket, and 71 years of knowing how to stay alive. A girl with braided hair and glittery shoes who was going to grow up into someone the world wasn't entirely prepared for, and who would probably be magnificent, and who had already, at 7 years old, done something that would outlast the day she'd done it. Somewhere behind them, a clinic, a signed document. A woman named Elena standing up from a chair in a waiting room and walking through a door toward the rest of her life, with her hands steadier than they'd been when she'd arrived. Somewhere behind them, a second-floor office in Scottsdale, where the accounting had finally arrived and taken its seat and would stay seated now until the work was complete. Somewhere ahead, Phoenix. The garage with its changed meaning, which would have to be examined and understood and eventually either left or reclaimed. That was a conversation for another day, a vote for another meeting, a decision that the full club would make together with the full information, the way it was supposed to work, the way it would work. And somewhere ahead, just past noon, a phone call. Gage reached into himself for the specific feeling of the call he'd made that morning. The "Are you actually okay?" The "I've got practice" call afternoon, the 14 minutes that had run over by 4 because some things needed the time they needed. And he held on to it the way you held on to things that were true when the world was running fast and uncertain. She'd answered. That was it. That was the whole of it. The beginning of a longer road, not a destination, not a resolution, just an answered phone in a parking lot in Scottsdale, a door held open instead of closed, a 17-year-old who had figured out the difference between being present and being there, and who had decided, on the basis of a 14-minute conversation, and whatever Mason had said in his texts, to give the thing one more chance to be different than it had been. He was going to make that count. The road ran straight, the desert ran wide, the bikes ran true. Iron vultures. 8 men, minus one who'd turned out to be other than he'd seemed, plus 7 who had proven out across 2 days of fire and grief and a girl's box of cookies to be exactly what they'd always claimed to be. Not clean, not simple. Not the kind of men whose scars photographed well, but the kind who showed up. Who knocked on doors at 3 a.m. and went around the backs of buildings and sat in the dirt with men who were breaking and said, "I know, I've got you." Who drove 90 minutes with a building layout in their pockets and walked through tunnels in the dark and stood in front of a man who'd bought their lease and their trust and their grief and said, "Not this, not anymore." Who ate cookies in a parking lot and listened to a child talk about the chemistry of chocolate and let themselves be seen as just people, just men, which was the thing they'd been all along and the thing the world had the hardest time seeing. The highway ran forward, the formation held, and Gage Mercer, road captain of the Iron Vultures MC, Arizona chapter, father of a 17-year-old soccer player who answered the phone when he finally called with something real, rode toward whatever the road had next with his hands steady on the bars and the wind at his back and the dead he carried riding with him, the way the dead always rode. Not as weight, not as punishment, but as company, as the reason, as the answered question, as the voice on the other end of the line when you finally called with something true. The desert opened, the bikes went forward. The day held everything it had cost and kept going anyway, the way days did, the way the road did, the way the best and most broken and most necessary things in the world did, without apology, without end.